What is the true story of the Parthenon? Welcome to Kallikrates, where history comes to life, and every video takes you into the fate of those who have shaped the world. Today, get ready to travel to the heart of Athens, on the sacred hill of the Acropolis, where one of the most famous monuments of antiquity stands, the Parthenon. Born from the will of Pericles, built by the hands of the greatest architects, and adorned with the masterpieces of Phidias, this temple was not only dedicated to Athena, it embodied the power, wealth, and pride of an entire civilization. But before embarking on a new adventure, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you and enjoy your journey. Between 650 and 450 before Christ, the Mediterranean world and its neighboring regions underwent major transformations, both politically and culturally. It was the time when the Neo-Babylonian Empire, born on the ruins of Assyria, asserted its power in the Near East before giving way to the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Babylonian rulers, such as Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar II, dominated Mesopotamia and Syria, while Babylon, their capital, was surrounded by monumental walls. These kings encouraged artistic and architectural flourishing, as evidenced by the Ishtar Gate and the famous processional way, marking a temporary golden age before the Persian conquest. Towards the end of the 6th century before Christ, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, stretched from Asia Minor to the edges of India. Cyrus was distinguished by his policy of integrating conquered peoples and left a lasting imprint. His successor, Cambyses II, annexed Egypt, while Darius I organized the vast territory into satrapies, introduced an efficient administrative system, and built the capital of Persepolis. The Persians also favored large roads like the Royal Road, which stretched through Anatolia and Mesopotamia, ensuring the rapid circulation of messengers and goods. Meanwhile, at the other end of the Eurasian continent, the Eastern Zhou dynasty in China reigned from 770 before Christ over a fragmented territory of rival principalities. Between 650 and 450 before Christ, the spring and autumn period continued, marked by the emergence of great local lineages that challenged weakened royal authority. Each state sought to consolidate its borders, organize larger armies, and form shifting alliances. Thinkers and strategists began to forge political and moral doctrines, anticipating the rise of schools of thought like Confucianism and Taoism in the following centuries. In Italy, Etruscan kingdoms dominated much of the northern and central peninsula. From the 7th century before Christ, they thrived through agriculture, metal exploitation, and maritime trade in the Mediterranean. Cities like Veii, Tarquinia, or Cerveteri displayed notable artistic refinement, particularly in goldsmithing, mural painting, and bronze sculpture. Meanwhile, the first Latin communities emerged in the region of Latium, not far from the Tiber. These more modest groups gradually organized into confederations and laid the foundations of future Roman power. Contact with the Etruscans helped shape their nascent culture. On the other side of the Atlantic, in Mesoamerica, the Olmec civilization reached its peak between the 8th and 6th centuries before Christ. The sites of San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes witnessed symbolic art dominated by the famous colossal heads sculpted in basalt. The Olmec elites established significant ritual practices, including sacrifices and offerings of luxurious objects. Their influence spread to other Mesoamerican cultures, which adopted certain artistic motifs and symbolic systems. Despite archaeological gaps, the Olmecs appear as a mother culture that paved the way for later civilizations like the Maya. Their religious legacy also inspired neighboring peoples. Everywhere, trade routes play a crucial role in the circulation of raw materials, innovations, and ideas. Caravans transport obsidian, a precious volcanic stone for making sharp tools, from Anatolia to the Levant and Egypt. Tin, indispensable for bronze production, follows complex routes linking Central Asia to the metallurgical centers of the Near East. By sea, Phoenician navigators crisscrossed the Mediterranean, establishing trading posts and ensuring a flourishing trade of luxury items, purple dye, and alphabets. This intense commercial activity fuels the development of port cities, which become points of contact between civilizations. Thus, the world experiences increasing interconnectedness. In the mid-6th century before Christ, a monetary turning point occurs in Lydia, a kingdom in Asia Minor governed by the Mermnad dynasty. King Croesus, famous for his wealth, perfects the use of coins struck in electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. This innovation facilitates commercial transactions and quickly spreads in the Greek world and beyond. City-states gradually adopt their own currencies, marked by identity symbols. The appearance of money meets a practical need for valuing goods and a unit of account, allowing for unprecedented growth in maritime and land exchanges. Such coins often feature a lion or a bull, evoking the power of Lydian authority. Militarily, the Greek world innovates with the emergence of hoplites, heavily armed infantrymen equipped with a round shield, a spear, and a bronze or reinforced linen cuirass. Gathered in a phalanx, these citizen soldiers close ranks tightly, forming a wall of shields. This tactic, favoring group cohesion over individual heroism, transforms the conduct of war. It requires collective training and fosters a new form of solidarity among fighters. Cities like Sparta specialize in intensive military training, while Athens and Corinth improve their fleets to secure their sea routes. Simultaneously, the Greeks adopt and adapt the Phoenician alphabet, laying the foundation for classical Greek writing. This tool promotes the emergence of a literate culture, where the transmission of knowledge, from epic poems to civic laws, becomes easier. This intellectual refinement is particularly illustrated in Ionia, on the coast of Asia Minor, where pre-Socratic philosophy is born. Thinkers like Thales of Miletus or Anaximander question the origin and structure of the cosmos, partially breaking away from mythological explanations. They attempt to describe nature by rational principles, paving the way for later Greek science and profoundly influencing the Western philosophical tradition. This intellectual impulse will accompany the transformation of the Aegean world. Religiously, the Greeks practice a civic polytheism, characterized by the veneration of a multitude of gods linked to each city. The cult of Athena in Athens, Apollo in Delphi, or Hera in Argos, illustrates this cult network. Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, such as Delphi or Olympia, attract pilgrims from all over Greece who come to consult the oracle or honor the deities during great festivals. Public ceremonies, financed by the elites, strengthen community cohesion. In parallel, influences from Egypt or the Near East mix with these traditions, creating a religious syncretism visible in certain mystery rites. These secret cults, accessible to a restricted circle of initiates, fascinate and intrigue outside observers. Between 490 and 479, before Christ, the Greek world is shaken by the Persian Wars, opposing the Hellenic city-states to the Persian Empire. The battles of Marathon in 490, Thermopylae and Salamis in 480, and then Plataea in 479, mark as many decisive confrontations. At Marathon, the Athenians, supported by their Plataean allies, repel the invasion led by Darius the Thirst. 10 years later, the troops of Xerxes invade Greece again, destroying Athens before being defeated at sea and on land. This common victory strengthens the pan-Hellenic consciousness and boosts the prestige of Athens, now the champion of Greek freedom. It also lays the groundwork for an acute rivalry between Athens and Sparta. Within Athenian society itself, this period sees the emergence of new political tensions. The landed aristocracy, strong in its ancestral prestige, clashes with the claims of an urban and rural populace seeking greater equality. Since the reforms of Solon, around 594 before Christ, and especially those of Cleisthenes, around 508 before Christ, democratic mechanisms have been put in place. Establishment of the ecclesia, an assembly of all male citizens, and the introduction of ostracism to remove the ambitious. However, the impact of military glory increases the influence of certain strategists at the risk of generating new internal conflicts. Athens then oscillates between democratic aspirations and fears of an oligarchic domination. In this wave of upheavals, Athens stands out for its capacity to innovate politically and culturally. The debates in the ecclesia spur institutional reforms, while the popular courts broaden citizen participation. Small farmers and artisans see their rights recognized, even though citizenship still excludes women, slaves, and medics. The vibrancy is also reflected in architecture and urban planning. Despite the Persian destructions, the city quickly recovers thanks to its maritime revenues and the contribution of its allies. The initial beautification projects foreshadow monumental constructions, future symbols of Athens' preeminent role in the Aegean world. At the same time, culture develops through contact with other cities, fostering artistic exchanges and intellectual innovations. Theater, poetry, and music know an unprecedented flourishing, nourished by a sense of shared identity and collective ambition. This historical acceleration occurs before the establishment of Athenian hegemony. In the aftermath of the Persian Wars, which truly end after the Greek victory at Plataea in 479 before Christ, Athens emerges from the ordeal profoundly transformed. During these conflicts, the city saw its territory ravaged by Persian armies, and its temples, notably on the Acropolis, were repeatedly set on fire. Despite these material losses, the victorious city gains a special prestige among other Greek city-states. The famous Battle of Salamis in 480 before Christ, where the Athenian fleet plays a decisive role by exploiting the narrow configuration of the strait, demonstrates the naval power of the Athenians. Now, the Athenian thalassocracy begins to take shape. The idea of federating the insular and coastal Greek cities around a new military alliance emerges, leading to the creation of the Delian League in 478 before Christ. The Delian League, so named because its treasury and council originally meet on the sacred island of Delos, constitutes a coalition of Greek cities eager to ensure common protection against any Persian resurgence. At the time, the stated goal remains mutual defense and the continuation of the war in Asia Minor to keep the Persians at bay. Each member of the League pays a tribute, often in monetary form, sometimes in the form of ships. This system of contribution allows Athens, the undisputed master of the fleet, to gain an increasingly marked ascendancy. Through its leadership position, the city consolidates ties with allies while asserting its authority. Athenian hegemony grows as the importance of naval power increases, and the city derives new revenues to finance structures and ambitions. Very quickly, the Delian League transforms into an instrument of Athenian domination. Cities that attempt to secede or dispute the tribute arrangements are brought to heel by force, as exemplified by the case of Naxos, which tries to leave the League but suffers an Athenian naval blockade around 470 before Christ. Gradually, the Allied cities end up losing their decision-making autonomy and are compelled to provide a stable financial contribution rather than arm their own vessels. This evolution further strengthens Athens' economic and maritime power, gradually becoming the main power of the Aegean Sea. Under the impetus of charismatic strategists, including Cimon, son of Miltiades, the city consolidates its protective role, while reaping the benefits of an increasingly centralized system. The death of Cimon and the political rise of Pericles mark a decisive turning point in this quest for hegemony. Pericles, elected strategos, resolutely steers the city towards the expansion of its maritime power and the implementation of institutions designed to promote popular participation. One of the key reforms concerns the misthos, this allowance paid to citizens to enable them to participate in public duties, notably in the sessions of the Heliaia, which is the court, and the Ecclesia, which is the assembly. Thanks to these remunerations, a greater number of Athenians can dedicate time to political affairs, thus ensuring the consolidation of a nascent democracy. In parallel, Pericles encourages the enlargement of the port of Piraeus, located a few kilometers from Athens, in order to develop trade and optimize the reception of allied fleets. This dynamic reinforces both the military supremacy and the political and economic influence of the city. In 454, before Christ, a crucial event symbolizes the political and ideological appropriation of the League by Athens, the transfer of the Delian treasure to the Acropolis. This decision, initiated by Pericles and his supporters, is officially justified by security reasons, as the Persian threat is not completely dismissed. However, many allies interpret this relocation as an additional sign of the domination exercised by the city over the rest of the League. Holding the treasure, indeed, means controlling the financing of military campaigns and major civic projects. By transferring the gold and silver to a sanctuary dedicated to Athena, the Athenians forge a link between their naval power and the sacred authority of the protective goddess. This association confers a religious legitimacy to their hegemony, while providing them with the resources to pursue their objectives. During this period of expansion, Pericles asserts himself as the most influential figure on the Athenian scene, strategos several times between 443 and 429. Before Christ, he defends a program of major works aimed at renovating the neighborhoods devastated by the Persians and erecting monuments glorifying the city. Beyond affirming Athenian prestige, the construction policy also has a social dimension, since it provides jobs to many citizens, medics, meaning foreign residents, and specialized artisans. The budgets for these projects largely come from the tribute of the Delian League, now stored on the Acropolis. The enhancement of Athens, celebrated in speeches and festivities, is thus as much a strategy of domination within the Greek world as it is about manifesting the city's gratitude to Athena, the protective goddess of Attica. The reconstruction of the sacred buildings destroyed during the Persian Wars is a priority for Pericles, who intends to erase the stigmas of the Persian invasion while establishing Athens as a beacon of Hellenism. The first redevelopment projects affect the Acropolis. Some archaic temples are restored, new sanctuaries are undertaken, and the sites are embellished with sumptuous sculptures and decorations. Simultaneously, the famous long walls are built between 461 and 456 before Christ, linking the urban area of Athens to its port of Piraeus. This linear fortification, composed of two parallel walls, ensures safe and continuous access to the sea even in case of a siege. Thus, Athenian strength largely rests on its fleet. The city can be supplied by sea and avoid terrestrial encirclement. This defensive innovation further cements Athens' naval primacy. At the same time, competition with Sparta, the other great land power of the Greek world, intensifies. Athens and Sparta had indeed cooperated during the Persian Wars, but their political systems and geopolitical ambitions differ deeply. The Spartans, attached to their oligarchic model and formidable land army, observe with suspicion the rise of Athens as the dominant naval power. The long walls, like Athenian activism in the Aegean Sea, fuel the suspicions of Sparta and its Peloponnesian allies. Pericles is aware of this. He seeks to demonstrate the superiority of his city not only by military force, but also by cultural and religious influence. The great sanctuaries, festivals, theaters, and diplomatic reception of delegations from all over Greece become means of showcasing Athenian glory. In this context, celebrating the victory over the Persians holds more than a commemorative dimension. It is about legitimizing Athens' position as the new champion of Greek freedom. The constructions on the Acropolis, financed by the treasury of the League, illustrate this desire to glorify the goddess Athena, protector of the Athenians, and to present the city as the main bulwark against the barbarians. Religious ceremonies, such as the Panathenaia, gain in splendor. One sees a multiplication of processions, athletic competitions, and dramatic representations. The Athenian people, brimming with pride, broadly support this program that values citizen participation and the feeling of belonging to a superior community. Moreover, the rigor of naval discipline and the professionalism of triremes enhance the attractiveness of military service, now perceived as an honor in the service of the city. Beyond the borders of Attica, the growing power of Athens is manifested by the establishment of garrisons and klereches. These colonies, where Athenian citizens are installed on lands confiscated from recalcitrant allies or defeated adversaries. This expansionist policy reinforces the city's authority over the Aegean space, but also arouses discontent and fears. The cities that make up the Delian League no longer feel protected, but rather monitored by Athens, which does not hesitate to impose its magistrates or punish any form of resistance. Within the city itself, some criticize Pericles and his supporters for diverting League funds to adorn Athens with architectural splendors. Yet, the majority of the population benefits directly or indirectly from the prosperity generated by maritime trade, the influx of money, and jobs provided by public works. The cultural and religious momentum, combined with the rise of maritime activity, thus shapes the image of a triumphant Athens, guardian of freedom against the Persian threat, but also a proponent of a burgeoning imperialism. The period preceding the erection of the classical Parthenon is rooted in a past when the Acropolis of Athens was not yet dominated by the Dorico-Ionic masterpiece that so many future generations would admire. Before being destroyed by the Persians in 480 before Christ, this rocky plateau, then a sacred site of Athena, already possessed several monuments dedicated to the tutelary goddess, including an archaic temple sometimes called the Old Hecatompedon. The epithet Hecatompedon, which literally means 100 feet long, underscores the honorable dimension of the sanctuary, even if its exact measurements, according to the standards of the time, are still debated. By the 6th century before Christ, the Acropolis had thus already endowed itself with a remarkable religious center, tributary to both Eastern architectural influences and the desire to assert in stone the preeminence of the goddess Athena Polias, that is, the protector of the city. One of the tasks of archaeologists is to unravel the various phases of this first great temple, often confused with other, older or parallel structures. The excavations, which reached their peak under the impetus of European archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries, have revealed traces of several successive archaic buildings. For example, the old Hecatompedon is sometimes distinguished from another earlier temple dedicated to Athena Polias, where, according to some sources, a cult statue in wood, Xoanon, venerated since the legendary times of the city's founding, was located. Epigraphic documents and accounts of ancient travelers, such as Pausanias, do not always provide perfectly clear indications to date and distinguish these edifices, so the terminology hecatompedon eventually encompassed several successive phases of construction. In any case, these archaic temples already provided a strong symbolic framework for the Athenians. Their architectural style, heir to the Doric that appeared in the Peloponnese, featured massive columns, simply flared capitals, and an entablature adorned with geometric or vegetal motifs, sometimes embellished with relief sculptures. Some monumental sculptures, such as the famous chorai, statues of young women in marble discovered in the sacred embankments, may have adorned the surroundings of this temple. These chorai, characterized by their elaborately pleated garments, archaic smile, and offerings in hand, testify to the great care the city devoted to the cult of Athena. It is likely that Athenian aristocrats, eager to display their piety and wealth, directly financed these statues as votive offerings to the goddess. The date of destruction of these archaic remains is central to understanding the evolution of the Acropolis. During the Second Persian invasion under Xerxes in 480 before Christ, Athens was largely evacuated by its population, which retreated to the island of Salamis. The Persians then set fire to the temples of the Acropolis, partially or totally destroying several sanctuaries, including this ancient hecatompedon. Modern excavations have unearthed numerous fragments of roofs, terracotta metopes, and charred sculptures buried in a fill that the Athenians created after their return. Pieces of chorai were found intentionally buried because the city, humiliated by the desecration of its sacred space, preferred to bury these broken effigies rather than leave them exposed in their ruined state. This act of burial is explained both by a respect for the deities and by the desire to make a clean break from a painful past. In the wake of these destructions, an important political and religious event is mentioned by several ancient sources, the Oath of Plataea. Its name comes from a Boeotian city, Plataea, where according to tradition, a great alliance of victorious Greek cities took place after the eponymous battle of 479 before Christ. According to the historian Diodorus of Sicily and other later authors, the allied cities vowed not to rebuild the sanctuaries burned by the Persians in order to keep alive the memory of the barbarism endured. Moreover, this ruin left visible would have served as a permanent testimony to the enemy's cruelty and pan-Hellenic solidarity. The charred temples, in this perspective, remained like sacred stigmas, urging the Greeks to remain vigilant and united. Nevertheless, modern historians debate the authenticity of this oath, as the ancient sources that mention it are often several centuries later than the events described. There also remains the question of which Greek cities actually respected such a prohibition in practice. The literary tradition insists that Athens, in particular, had committed not to rebuild the plundered sanctuaries before a certain period. Some specialists see it more as a later ideological construction, intended to explain why the Acropolis in the first half of the 5th century before Christ remained in ruins for so long, while other Greek cities like Sparta could hardly claim great comparable architectural reconstructions. Whatever the exact historical reality, this Oath of Plataea crystallized the notion of collective mourning and resistance against the Persian Empire. It was about demonstrating that Greek identity had been forged through trials, relying not just on military victories, but also on the moral will not to succumb to oblivion. From the Athenian point of view, this moral taboo on reconstruction held, at least in traditional discourse, a special value. The city, after the naval battle of Salamis in 480 before Christ and the one at Plataea, had gained considerable prestige, urging its own citizens to willingly accept the view of a destroyed sanctuary on their sacred hill must have been a significant act, showing everyone that Athens preserved the memory of barbaric outrages and served the pan-Hellenic cause. Yet, politics evolve, and the imperatives of a victorious city do not eternally coincide with the scrupulous respect of an oath, if it ever existed in the rigid form often mentioned. Over the decades, the city of Athens asserted itself as a hegemonic maritime power, notably through the Delian League, founded in 478 before Christ to continue the fight against the Persians and protect coastal cities. As Athens's maritime supremacy grew, with allies beginning to pay tribute to finance the city's military, cultural, and political projects, the Athenians embodied an unprecedented sense of identity pride. The idea of leaving the Acropolis in ruins became less compatible every day with the image of a city that now dominated the Aegean Sea and intended to rival Sparta's land power. Around 450–449. Before Christ, Pericles, rising as both an orator and strategist, consolidated his influence and promoted an ambitious policy aimed at enhancing the city's prestige. The historian Thucydides and other ancient authors describe Pericles as a wise statesman concerned with Athenian greatness and aware that an ambitious architectural program would be the tangible reflection of such greatness. In this context, the prolonged abandonment of the ruins on the Acropolis eventually appeared anachronistic, even damaging to the city's reputation. The Oath of Plataea stood then as a moral obstacle, a spiritual commitment preventing the launch of a vast reconstruction project. If it was still considered in force, it now needed to be questioned or reinterpreted for the city, both religiously and politically, to approve the rebirth of its sacred rock. This is where the debates about Pericles' decision to override what remained of this taboo come into play. Some say he claimed that the duration of the oath was limited, or that, given the Persian threats now reduced, it became legitimate to rebuild. Other historians think it was simply an ideological justification operation intended to legitimize the use of the common treasure of the Delian League to finance the works. Whatever the case, around 449, before Christ or shortly after, the decision to rebuild the sanctuaries of the Acropolis was made. The Athenians could now set in motion a monumental architectural project, celebrating both piety towards Athena and the glory of the triumphant city. This political audacity combined religious necessity, aspiration to grandeur, and geopolitical rivalry. From a religious point of view, Athena's priestesses and the faithful certainly had an interest in seeing the revival of cult sites worthy of the protective deity. Although the presence of ruins commemorated past suffering, carrying out new rituals and sacrifices in a restored or entirely rebuilt temple consolidated the spiritual identity of the city. The Acropolis had to become again what it was supposed to be, the beating heart of Athenian faith, a space where great festivals in honor of the goddess, particularly the Panathenaea, were perpetuated, gathering not only Athenian inhabitants, but also visitors from across the Greek world. Completing the reconstruction would demonstrate that Athena's power had not remained defeated, and that, despite the Persian devastation, the goddess continued to reign over her rock. On the civic level, Pericles and his entourage saw in the resumption of works a means to stimulate the economy, employ artisans, artists, and workers, and transform Athens into an essential cultural and artistic center. The memory of the war thus had to fade in favor of a collective ambition to make the Acropolis a dazzling success. New architectural processes, talented sculptors, abundant marble resources from Mount Pentelicus, and above all, substantial financial resources were going to enable a spectacular artistic momentum. The criticisms from part of the aristocracy were not lacking. Some judged the undertaking too costly or untimely. Others disapproved of the confiscation of the League's money to adorn Athens alone. Whatever the case, the resolution to build again prevailed. According to modern interpretations, the effective transgression of the Oath of Plataea was thus less a brutal rupture than a gradual evolution. The initial prohibition, often presented as an unyielding block, could be politically revised or bypassed when the context justified it. Even before the construction of the Parthenon itself, from the mid-450s before Christ, indications of preparations for the construction of buildings on the Acropolis were observable. The democratic reforms, already initiated by Cleisthenes at the end of the 6th century before Christ and continued under the leadership of figures like Ephialtes or Pericles, encouraged the emergence of a new power balance, where the assembly of the people could validate ambitious public works policies. Civic religion, a pivot of Athenian cohesion, was then mobilized to legitimize the construction of a more imposing temple than ever, dedicated to the victory and power of the goddess. Archaeological sources confirm that as early as 450-447 before Christ, certain earlier blocks began to be moved and reorganized, although the definitive structure of the Parthenon was not immediately erected. It was about assessing the solidity of the ground, establishing a rigorous plan, and having the marble blocks cut. During this time, the future of the archaic sculpted fragments also had to be determined. Some were already buried, while others rested in small sacred deposits. Out of respect for traditions, it was not a question of destroying them, but rather preserving them in this state, as witnesses of the Persian impious sacrilege. The cult of Athena Polias remained central. It is supposed that the cult statue, perhaps restored or even replaced by a more recent version, was honored in a transitional temple or under a temporary shelter. The Athenians, driven by the desire not to neglect the rites, thus proceeded with practical compromises, aware that complete and luxurious reconstruction would require time, labor, and money. Pericles' direct role in the political decision is illuminated by the strategy he adopted in the following years. Promoting major projects like the Parthenon, started in 447 before Christ, and completed around 432 before Christ, the Propylaea, the Erechtheion, and monumental statues entrusted to Phidias. All these projects were part of an overall program which the lifting of the taboo on reconstruction had paved the way for. The city, already adorned with glory from its maritime victories and naval power, was transforming into a major center of Greek culture, exhibiting its political triumphs on the temple pediments and in the splendor of carved stone. The memory of the archaic ruins, still buried beneath the sacred soil, was not, however, denied. On the contrary, it now served to exalt the rebirth of Athens, in contrast to the state of abandonment that everyone remembered. The magnificence of the new sanctuaries aimed to remind that Athena and her people had risen stronger and united in the face of adversity. Historians emphasize the symbolic significance of this evolution. The Acropolis, once broken by the invader, became a perpetual site of commemoration and homage. Through the figure of the goddess, Athens was not only resisting militarily against the Persian East, but was also forging an identity discourse where the city became a hub of unparalleled philosophical, artistic, and political creations. The Oath of Plataea, while still evoked, gradually lost its direct prescriptive force, becoming rather the illustration of a foundational chapter, that of the Pan-Hellenic alliance, the necessary sacrifice, and the triumph over foreign tyranny. attention's now focused on building a new edifice, which, while celebrating the goddess's benefits, would serve as a stage for stylistic innovation and the affirmation of an art described today as classical. Literary sources also attest that, to religiously justify the initiative, it was emphasized how Athena, as the city's protector, deserved a temple worthy of her benefits. After all, the victory over the Persians was interpreted as a divine gift. The burning of the archaic temples had certainly been a sacrilege, but the goddess had allowed her people to prevail. Rebuilding, from a religious point of view, meant not forgetting the former humiliation, but offering a new, more admirable place of worship, capable of honoring the victorious goddess at her true value. On the civic level, the construction of the Parthenon and other monuments became a way to federate the population. Artisans, citizens, or medics, stonecutters, sculptors, painters, and goldsmiths flocked to participate in the enterprise, creating a dynamism that benefited the entire Attic economy. If opposition to breaking the taboo persisted, it seems not to have contained the movement of national pride driven by Pericles and his allies. Some detractors denounced the arrogance of dedicating so many resources to monumental projects instead of ensuring the safety of allied cities. Others saw the transfer of the Delian League treasury to the Acropolis in 454 before Christ as an act of clear imperialism, trampling on the initial spirit of equality among partners. However, the majority of Athenians supported this orientation, flattered to see the city adorned with constructions that would make their mark in the history of art and politics. The archaic sanctuaries, buried and silent, gave way to a horizon of columns, sculpted pediments, and grand processions. In the middle of the 5th century before Christ, as the city of Athens, driven by its strategists and assemblies, intensifies its political power, a large-scale construction project begins on the Acropolis, the building of a new temple dedicated to Athena. The project, which officially starts in 447 before Christ, is part of the city's reconstruction process following the numerous destructions of the previous decade due to wars against the Persian Empire. At that time, the city is under the influence of Pericles, a major figure who intends to make Athens the cultural and civic beacon of the Greek world. The guiding idea is to erect a colossal structure, both a religious sanctuary and a symbol of the city's glory. Architects Iktinos and Kallikrates, two names that history will remember, are entrusted with the task of designing the building's structure. Meanwhile, the artistic direction is given to Phidias, the most renowned sculptor of his time, whose fame extends well beyond the borders of Attica. Together, they initiate an extensive construction project, employing cutting-edge technologies for the time, and aiming to create a monument that surpasses the imagination of their contemporaries. The issue of funding quickly sparks debates within the Athenian assembly itself. In fact, Pericles justifies using the funds collected from allied cities under the Delian League, an alliance initially formed to contain the Persian threat in the Aegean Sea. This financial resource, made up of a tribute imposed on member cities, is officially intended to maintain the common fleet and cover military expenses. However, under Pericles' direction, a substantial portion of this money is redirected to the coffers of the Acropolis project. Such a move immediately draws criticism, notably from some political opponents. Thucydides, the Athenian historian, reports in his writings the tensions this decision causes among the allies, who believe that defense against the Persians should not fund Athens' aesthetic ambitions. Nonetheless, despite the controversies, the project progresses, driven by a clear desire to illuminate the city with unparalleled prestige. The construction itself employs innovative techniques for the time, resulting from slow accumulation of know-how through generations of builders. The material of choice is Pentelic marble, extracted about 16 kilometers from the city in the mountains located to the northeast of Athens. This marble, renowned for its brilliant whiteness and fine grain, is deemed ideal for a temple of such magnitude. The blocks are transported to the Acropolis using specially equipped carts, then moved thanks to ingeniously designed cranes and lifting ramps. On site, stonemasons meticulously assemble the blocks, often joined by dovetail joints, a sophisticated interlocking system ensuring the structure's solidity. Beyond mere robustness, the architects introduce optical refinements such as entasis, the slight curvature of the columns aimed at correcting the impression of concavity a too long straight line would produce. Similarly, the stylobate, meaning the platform on which the columns rest, has a slight horizontal convexity to counterbalance the illusion of sagging at the center of the platform. These details, invisible to the untrained eye, nevertheless attest to an arduous quest for harmony and visual perfection. The construction, lasting 15 years, involves a considerable number of people from various backgrounds. Athenian stonemasons are joined by metics, these foreign residents allowed to live in the city but deprived of certain political rights. Thanks to their specialized skills, they prove essential in carving, polishing, and fitting the marble blocks. Public slaves, for their part, handle heavy manual tasks, transport the water needed to moisten the blocks, and participate in cleaning the site. Contrary to some later portrayals, the work is not exclusively forced. Free workers, regularly paid, also participate in the temple's erection. Moreover, several trades interchange to organize logistics, manage supplies, and administer the payment of wages. Numerous artisans, such as sculptors, carpenters, and even gilders, pass through the site at one time or another, making this architectural project a massive crossroads of talent. At the top of this organization stands Phidias, responsible not only for the major artistic choices, but also for a delicate coordination between the various trades. He is reputed to have supervised all the decorative works, from the form of the reliefs to the final polishing of the statues. His authority comes as much from his creative talent as from his special status. A close friend of Pericles, he enjoys privileged access to the political and financial workings of the project. The sums involved in the construction of the Parthenon are colossal, as evidenced by inscription IG I3 436, a document engraved on stone listing the expenses and naming the foremen responsible for various sectors. This inscription provides a unique insight into the site's accounting. It reveals the amounts allocated to marble, transportation, salaries, but also to gilding and pigments intended to enhance the polychromy of the decorations. Thanks to this data, modern historians can partially reconstruct the logistical and financial stakes of an unprecedented enterprise in the history of Athens. The collaboration between Iktinos and Kallikrates, often mentioned in ancient texts, illustrates the complementarity of their skills. Iktinos, considered a master of Doric architecture, would have contributed his expertise in the typical arrangement of Greek temples, notably in the design of the columns and the distribution of interior spaces. Kallikrates, on the other hand, would have intervened more particularly in aspects related to structural stability and the concrete implementation of the construction plan. Although historical sources remain fragmentary, several fragmentary documents attribute to Kallikrates the design of ingenious devices facilitating the lifting of blocks to the heights of the Acropolis. The final result reflects a perfect balance between technical rigor and artistic ambition. Despite the subtle curves and optical adjustments, the general symmetry remains harmonious. Today, careful observation of the preserved elements still allows us to appreciate this ongoing dialogue between architects, artists, and workers around a project that was already perceived at the time as extraordinary. The first stages of the construction involve preparing the ground. Teams have to level previous remains and flatten the rocky surface of the Acropolis, while ensuring the foundation will support the colossal weight of the future edifice. The foundations are laid shortly after 447 before Christ, and the phase of raising the outer columns then spans several years. The cella, a sacred space intended to house the cult statue of Athena, begins to take shape as the interior walls are erected and the roof begins to cover the first bays. As construction progresses, specialized teams devote themselves to the sculpting of decorative elements such as capitals, triglyphs, and metopes before their final placement. By 438 before Christ, the main structure is advanced enough to allow the installation of the statue of Athena, also carried out under Phidias's supervision. However, the complete finishing of the temple, including ornamental details and the assembly of the frieze, continues until 432 before Christ. Archaeological sources indicate that this relatively short time frame for such a construction reflects Athens' immense desire to prove its superiority both to its allies and its rivals. The symbolic importance of this project cannot be underestimated. It reflects the ambition of a city aware of its role in the Greek world. The Parthenon, through its construction, becomes the center of technical and artistic innovations, but also a political emblem. In the eyes of the Athenians, the building embodies victory over Persia, naval supremacy, and the cultural vitality of the nascent democracy. Decisions concerning the allocation of resources are the subject of deliberations where aesthetic arguments intertwine with political rivalries. Pericles and Phidias must prove that the project serves the city's interest, rather than merely satisfying a personal quest for glory. The scale of the temple, its demanding aesthetics, and the height of its columns express the collective faith in an Athens proud of its gods and civic identity. The period from 447 to 432 before Christ thus marks the triumph of a collective vision orchestrated by brilliant architects and supported by the energy of countless artisans. The Parthenon, an emerging masterpiece, already reflects the zenith of Athens and its grandeur. The Parthenon is primarily presented as a peripteral temple of Doric style, meaning it is surrounded by a continuous row of columns on each side. In total, the facade features 8 columns, while the long sides house 17. This choice of an 8x17 plan, unprecedented in earlier Greek architecture, underscores the desire to assert the power and singularity of the city of Athens. However, behind this Doric peristyle, one discovers a cella that incorporates elements of the Ionic order. A double row of more slender columns is integrated, combining 2 architectural traditions that are usually distinct. This combination illustrates Athens' desire to embody both the Doric sobriety associated with continental Greece and the Ionic elegance, echoing its influence in the Aegean Sea. The ratio used to determine the dimensions of the building, often called the attic module, follows a 4:9 relationship between the width and the length. This harmonious proportion can be found not only in the general plan, but also in the relationship between the height of the columns and the spacing between them. The designers, aware of the visual distortions produced by a vast building in the open air, made subtle optical corrections. The stylobate, that is to say the platform on which the columns rest, is not perfectly flat. It features a slight swell of about 60 millimeters in the center. Likewise, the corner columns, more exposed to sunlight, are slightly thicker and inclined inward. These adjustments prevent any sagging or distortion effect when observing the temple from the outside, contributing to this impression of visual perfection so often praised by travelers of antiquity and the modern era. This attention to volumetric balance was also accompanied by a coloring program, far from the monochrome image that time seems to have imposed on our contemporary eyes. Recent chemical analyses have revealed traces of pigments of Egyptian origin, notably an intense blue, as well as reds and ochres applied to certain friezes and moldings. Pieces of bronze, and sometimes gold, served as metallic highlights, emphasizing the hair of the deities, the edges of their garments, or even the smallest detail of a relief. The use of these metals, beyond the ornamental aspect, also contributed to enhancing the monument's brilliance when bathed in the Attic sun. In the mid-5th century before Christ, Athens celebrated its victories against the Persian Empire by erecting the Parthenon, a temple dedicated to the tutelary goddess Athena. At the heart of this building, the scale of the sculptural program reflects the artistic ambition of the city. The metopes, the Ionic frieze, and the pediments illustrate the myths, rituals, and values that unite gods and mortals. Phidias, a renowned sculptor, ensured overall coherence, while the artists under his supervision combined technical innovation and traditional references. This ensemble embodies the pinnacle of classical Greek sculpture, marrying harmony and expressive power. The metopes, numbering 92, extend across the temple's exterior faces. Each side presents a distinct mythological conflict, akin to the contemporary battles Athens fought against foreign powers. On the southern face, the Centauromachy depicts the confrontation between the centaurs and the Lapiths, symbolizing the struggle between civilization and barbarism. To the east, the Gigantomachy celebrates the supremacy of the Olympian gods over the giants, affirming the victory of cosmic order over chaos. To the north, the Amazonomachy showcases the duel between Greeks and Amazons, a people of formidable female warriors. Finally, the fall of Troy directly references the Homeric cycle, recalling Odysseus's cunning and the Achaeans' heroism. Each of these scenes, sculpted in high relief, stands out with the energy of the postures and the expressiveness of the faces. On each metope, the Pentelic marble reveals the dexterity of the artisans who highlight tense muscles, flowing drapery, and brandished weapons. The chosen scenes reflect Athens' desire to identify with legendary heroes, as if the city were renewing through its own courage the victory of divine order over destructive forces. The Greeks thus saw in these fabulous battles an echo of their recent triumphs, establishing a parallel between epic and history. Furthermore, the arrangement of the metopes along the peristasis ensured a rhythmic, almost cinematic reading for the faithful attending the rites. The accumulation of battles in a relatively confined space also testified to the Athenians' attraction to demonstrations of strength and formal virtuosity. The Ionic frieze, about 160 meters long, unfolds on the upper part of the inner walls behind the colonnade. Carved in bas relief, it illustrates the Panathenaic procession, a major civic and religious festival honoring Athena. Every 4 years, the citizens of Athens offered a sumptuous peplos to the goddess, crafted by a select group of young maidens. On the stone, riders, chariots, bearers of offerings, and magistrates advance in measured harmony. The horses, with powerful necks, symbolize the city's vigor. Sometimes, one can discern old men carrying branches, or musicians setting the pace of the parade. At the center, the scene of the peplos still sparks debates. Some see it as a mythical episode, others as the actual consecration of a sacred garment. This frieze expresses the unity of the civic community, from ordinary citizens to political elites. The Athenians could recognize themselves in it, feeling like participants in a shared ceremony rather than mere spectators. Some remind us that this iconography establishes a contrast with the warrior metopes, emphasizing internal order and collective participation. The treatment of the frieze, less dramatic than that of the metopes, conveys a solemn tranquility. Despite the delicacy of the bas-relief, the mastery of anatomical drawing remains delicate, evident in both human poses and the detailed folds of the draperies. The cavalcade is particularly studied, each horse animated by a subtle movement that evokes the nobility of equestrian trials. Under the vibrant light of Greece, the frieze once radiated colors of which only rare traces remain today. At the ends of the roof, the east and west pediments are carved from fine marble, composing two triangular scenographies. The east pediment tells of Athena's birth, emerging armed from Zeus's forehead under the amazed gaze of the other gods. This scene underscores the divine origin of Athens' power. On the west pediment, the dispute between Athena and Poseidon for domination of Attica shows each god offering a gift to the inhabitants. Poseidon's trident brings forth salt water, while Athena's olive tree brings prosperity and peace. The citizens, embodied by King Cecrops, choose the olive tree, sealing the goddess's guardianship over the city. The original sculptures have been largely damaged, but ancient accounts and some preserved fragments still offer a glimpse of their initial extraordinary splendor. The frontal and lateral figures were harmoniously arranged to fit the triangular shape, giving the impression of a theatrical drama emerging from the roof. Phidias applied his famous wet drapery technique here, rendering the draperies so thin that they almost embrace the underlying anatomy. This approach enhances vibrancy and realism while maintaining the idealism inherent in classical statuary. The gods, heroes, and secondary characters seem to be in dialogue, as if commenting on the central event. Subtle adjustments of proportions compensated for the height so that the ensemble remained legible from the ground. The colors, now almost completely faded, highlighted certain elements like the shields, horses, or headdresses. The overall effect was to amaze the visitor, glorifying the goddess and recalling her crucial role in Athens' destiny. Phidias, master architect of this vast enterprise, was praised for his ingenuity and aesthetic sense, but he also found himself at the heart of a legal affair. Shortly after the creation of the chryselephantine statue of Athena Parthenos, approximately 13 meters high, he was accused of embezzling gold and impiety. Some of Pericles' political opponents accused him of hiding his own face in the decoration or stealing part of the precious metal. Ancient sources differ on the outcome of the trial, but it is known that this scandal removed Phidias from Athens and dealt a blow to his reputation. This ordeal reveals the political tensions surrounding the use of the treasury of the Delos League, the main financer of the great works of the Acropolis. The artist had to leave the city, yet leaving behind an unmatched sculptural legacy, whose influence had a lasting impact on Greek sculpture and later Western arts. The excellence of this sculptural program is due in particular to the polychromy, now almost disappeared, which enhanced every detail. The Greeks applied mineral or organic pigments on the stone to bring life to the fabrics, the hairstyles, and the architectural elements. Sometimes, highlights in bronze or gold accented the divine armors and jewelry. This practice contrasted with the current image of Greek art as immaculate white marble. In reality, the overall effect must have impressed pilgrims, showcasing not only the technical virtuosity of the sculptors, but also the religious fervor that animated Athens. One can imagine the shimmering brilliance of the metops, the colorful dynamic of the frieze, and the almost living aspect of the gods occupying the pediments. Far from being a mere ornament, this polychromy reinforced the sacred and civic message, reminding of Athena's generosity and the mortals' trust in her protection. Through metopes, frieze, and pediments, the Parthenon staged Athenian identity, positioning the city as a champion of Greek ideals. The epic narratives were then anchored in the daily lives of the faithful, who found in these sculptures the echo of their own patriotic pride. The allusions to the defense of a just order, to heroic bravery, and to Athena's protective benevolence fused into a coherent whole, designed to remind of the rank the city claimed within the Greek world. These same reliefs, still admired centuries later, would nurture the imagination of generations of artists and travelers. When one contemplates today the preserved fragments, one realizes just how much the Athenians knew how to orchestrate a discourse where art, religion, and politics merged to exalt the power of a free and prosperous city. Other Greek cities had ornate temples, but none really rivaled with the narrative complexity and the profusion of details found in the Parthenon. The care given to the postures, the virtuosity of the draperies, and the subtle balance between inner peace and military glory made this sanctuary unique. Ancient travelers willingly mentioned this sensation of entering a space where the presence of the goddess seemed tangible. By contemplating the gigantomachy, the amazonomachy, or the Panathenaic procession, each one discovered a proud Athens, looking to the future while remaining faithful to its founding myths. The sculptural ensemble of the Parthenon presented itself as the mirror of a city that had managed to unify artistic splendor and the strength of its collective identity, thus elevating the temple to the rank of a reference for the entire Greek world, even beyond in the cultural history of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western world. This aesthetic triumph remained exemplary. The construction of the Parthenon on the Acropolis of Athens led to the erection of a majestic statue dedicated to the city's protective goddess, Athena Parthenos. Designed in the middle of the 5th century before Christ, it stood about 13 meters tall and was distinguished by a sumptuous assembly of gold and ivory, a technique known as chryselephantine. According to estimates passed down by ancient sources, no fewer than 40 talents of gold, a considerable amount, were used to adorn its surface. The use of ivory, invaluable at the time, reinforced its sacred character and highlighted the finesse of its execution. To the ancient public, this offering reflected Athenian splendor while affirming divine power. Indeed, Athena, daughter of Zeus, was revered as the guardian of the city, giving this sanctuary a central role in the spiritual and economic life of the polis. The accounts given by the historian Pausanias, although several centuries later, helped to reconstruct the radiance that the statue may have emanated to the faithful who came to meditate. The goddess's shield, adorned with scenes of the gigantomachy, that primordial myth narrating the battle of the Olympian gods against the giants, manifested Athena's warrior power and, by extension, the collective strength of the city. Thus, even the decorative details told a mythical story, valuing victory and civilization against chaos. In every feature, the statue exalted civic pride, crystallizing the identity of Athens in the heart of classical Greece. The statue was not merely a simple artistic feat designed to dazzle visitors. It also held a highly practical role for the city, as it served as a veritable treasure chest. Within the sanctuary itself, several compartments allowed for the storage of considerable sums, primarily derived from the tribute collected from the allied cities within the Delian League, a naval federation under Athens' aegis. The Athenians had indeed repatriated the treasury of this league to the Acropolis in 454 before Christ, under the pretext of safeguarding it in a sacred place. In reality, this maneuver also signified Athens' growing influence over the Aegean world. The funds kept near the statue were intended not only to finance military and architectural ventures, but also to support the cultural flourishing of the city. The maintenance of naval forces, crucial for maintaining Athenian thalassocracy, thus found a secured source of funding close to the tutelary goddess. Offerings brought by individuals or delegations from distant cities were also added to this already astounding treasure. In the religious mentality of the time, depositing a precious object or sum of money near Athena's statue was equivalent to seeking her protection and blessing. This link provided the population with a sense of security, as the statue, aside from being watched by the sanctuary's guardians, was under the constant vigilance of the goddess herself. With each religious festival, the votive aspect was reinforced. Athena was honored not only with prayers, but also by entrusting her with the resources necessary for collective prosperity. Through this mechanism, the economic dimension and spiritual function were intimately linked, making the Parthenon an indispensable place for the management of public affairs. If the statue of Athena Parthenos and the associated treasury were permanently located on the Acropolis, the worship of the goddess was expressed with particular splendor during the Great Panathenaea. This event, celebrated every 4 years, was the most prestigious festival in honor of Athena, and attracted not only the Athenians, but also visitors from across the Greek world. On this occasion, the city unveiled a complex and lavish ceremonial program. The procession began in the Kerameikos, the Potter's Quarter, and one of the most bustling outer areas of Athens, making its way to the Acropolis along the Sacred Way. Richly dressed musicians, priests, magistrates, horsemen, and bearers of offerings advanced under the admiring gaze of the crowd, while animals destined for sacrifices followed the procession. The central element of this procession was the presentation of a new peplos, a sumptuous hand-woven robe intended to dress the cult statue of Athena Polias. The difference between Athena Parthenos, housed in the great cella of the Parthenon, and Athena Polias, honored in an older temple, might seem subtle, but the Athenians clearly distinguished several aspects of their goddess. The peplos, decorated with mythological scenes glorifying Athena, was presented as a collective offering, symbolizing the city's devotion. Once this peplos reached the top of the Acropolis, the old sacred garment was removed and replaced with the new one, in a solemn gesture filled with emotion. Although Phidias's chryselephantine statue was not truly covered by this textile, as its dimensions and material were unsuitable, the celebration highlighted the importance of sewing and female craftsmanship within the community. The renewal of the garment proposed a parallel with the perpetual vitality of the city, placed under Athena's protection. In addition to this presentation of the peplos, the Great Panathenaea included a series of rituals and contests exalting civic identity. Sacrifices established the link between humans and gods. Oxen were slaughtered on the altar, and then the meat, after a portion was burned as an offering, was shared among participants. This collective banquet confirmed the unity of the city around its protective deity. Moreover, musical and poetic competitions took place in the Theater of Dionysus, while sporting events were held in the stadium. Horse and chariot races, where wealthy citizens capable of acquiring horses and chariots excelled, alternated with more popular events, such as the armed race or the torch race. Winners received amphorae of sacred oil, a precious commodity harvested in Athena's olive groves, recognizable by images of the goddess engraved on the vases. In this way, every citizen could feel part of the religious fervor and cultural emulation inherent to the Panathenaea. The Athenians saw in these events a confirmation of the robustness of their democracy, as everyone could attend the festivities and strive ardently to honor Athena. We must not forget the rhapsode contests, those poets who recited Homer's epics, reviving the exploits of heroes and founding mythical heritage in the memories. These public recitations, highly appreciated by the crowd, emphasized the importance of education in the city. The training of the mind occupied an essential place in the Greek ideal, hence the exercise of speech, the knowledge of myths, and the mastery of arts. Under the majestic gaze of Athena Parthenos, each discipline, be it athletic, musical, or literary, was inscribed in a celebration of collective excellence to which all aspired. In the context of these festivities, the religious dimension intertwined closely with political and social life. The organization of the contests, the selection of responsible magistrates, the distribution of prizes, and the supervision of the procession largely depended on civic institutions. Thus, the Areopagus, the Council of the 500 known as the Bull, and the People's Assembly were involved in preparing the festival, confirming the status of Athena as the guarantor of democratic order. For an international audience unfamiliar with ancient Greece, it is worth recalling that these institutions formed the backbone of Athenian democracy. The Areopagus, formerly composed of aristocrats, saw its prerogatives reduced but retained some judicial functions. The Bull, drawn by lot, examined legislative proposals and prepared assembly sessions. The Ecclesia, where all male citizens could sit, made the final decisions. Through the Panathenaea, all these municipal entities displayed their respect for the goddess by ensuring the sacred order of the ritual. Since it included music, athletics, sacrifices, offerings, and the distribution of meat, every segment of society was represented. The metics, foreigners residing in Athens without being citizens, often played a secondary role, but could still participate in some contests or exercises, thus demonstrating the open yet hierarchical nature of the community. Women were not admitted to political assemblies, but their contribution to the making of the peplos highlighted the symbolic importance of the female role in perpetuating the cult and fulfilling the rituals. Under Athena's benevolence, this festival transcended simple religious confines to embody the celebration of the city united around its protectress, ensuring collective harmony and adherence to an ideal of virtue and courage. The period extending from 431 to 146, before Christ saw the Parthenon evolve in a profoundly changed political, military, and cultural context. Wars, institutional reforms, and external dominations succeeded one another without overshadowing the religious and civic prestige surrounding the great sanctuary dedicated to Athena. The outbreak of the Peloponnesian War in 431 before Christ pitted Athens against Sparta and its allies, progressively drawing the entire Greek world into a major conflict. Urban fortifications, already rehabilitated after the Persian invasions, were once again put to the test, although the Parthenon, a symbol of Athenian power, remained a sacred place spared from destruction. During this long conflict, the city carried out regular maintenance of the temple to keep the building in good condition despite the tense context. Votive offerings, deposited in honor of Athena, continued to flow in, hoping to obtain the goddess's protection in these dramatic circumstances. However, budgetary priorities shifted towards the military effort, reducing some embellishment projects already envisioned. Artisans remained employed for minor repairs, filling marble cracks and ensuring the roof remained watertight. The cult itself continued almost without interruption, a testament to the Parthenon's central religious role. The year 411 before Christ marked a political turning point in Athens with the establishment of an oligarchic regime that temporarily sidelined democracy. In this context, the assembly was reduced and the government dominated by a restricted council, known as the Council of the 400. Despite this institutional upheaval, religious life remained a factor of collective identity. The Parthenon continued to host ceremonies, even serving at times as a pretext for political intrigues. Offerings to Athena became somewhat more modest, reflecting the city's serious financial difficulties. Nevertheless, the oligarchic authority understood the symbolic importance of the building, preserving most of its architectural integrity. Athens' defeat at the hands of Sparta in 404 before Christ led to the fall of this regime and the installation of the tyranny of the 30, an unpopular group of oligarchs. During this time, the city experienced political terror, but the Parthenon remained relatively unscathed, continuing to be a spiritual refuge. After a few months, democratic resistance organized and succeeded in overthrowing the 30 in 403 before Christ, restoring democracy. To affirm this institutional renewal, the Athenians perpetuated the cult of Athena and endeavored to ensure the temple's material stability. Solemn ceremonies then became a symbol of the renewed collective hope. In the middle of the 4th century before Christ, Macedonian power emerges under the leadership of Philip II, father of Alexander the Great. While Athens seeks to maintain its independence, Greek rivalries offer Macedonia the opportunity to assert itself. After Philip II's death in 336 before Christ, Alexander consolidates Macedonian hegemony before leading his triumphant campaigns in Asia. During his reign, the Parthenon remains a prestigious symbol of Hellenic tradition, even though the city of Athens must comply with the conqueror's directives. Upon Alexander's death in 323 before Christ, his general Antipater takes control in the region. Antipater, appointed regent of Macedonia, closely monitors Athens, limiting the city's political autonomy while preserving its religious traditions. The Parthenon thus continues its cult mission, and Athena remains the protective deity whose worship unites the local populations. Macedonian influence is evident in the imposition of garrisons and the appointment of magistrates favorable to the regency's interests. Despite this, Athens retains a major intellectual role, and there is a persistent interest in philosophy, literature, and architecture. At the heart of the city, the Parthenon remains a symbolic landmark for the faithful. Towards the end of the 4th century before Christ, Lycurgus, a renowned politician and orator, takes charge of Athens' financial affairs. He undertakes a rigorous management of public resources to consolidate institutions and restore the city's brilliance. His reforms include targeted investments in sacred monuments, including the Parthenon. Desiring to pay homage to Athena, Lycurgus orders the gilding of the ornamental shield of the statue, previously damaged, restoring the building to impressive splendor. He also oversees the sealing of roofs to prevent water infiltration that could damage the internal architecture. Under his impetus, the temple's splendor becomes a subject of pride for contemporary Athenians. Under Lycurgus's administration, great importance is also attached to the overall maintenance of the sacred complex. Engaged craftsmen periodically inspect the Doric columns to ensure nothing weakens the structure. Sculptors and painters, for their part, occasionally retouch the polychrome decorations where time and weather conditions have chipped away the pigments. The use of Pentelic marble requires particular attention as its white brilliance quickly tarnishes when urban dust accumulates. Although still under Macedonian influence, the city has a relative degree of freedom for these works, as even external authorities recognize the unique symbolic value of the temple. From the 3rd century before Christ onwards, the Hellenistic world fragments into several kingdoms, inheriting Alexander's empire. Among these regional powers are the Attalids, a dynasty ruling over Pergamon in Asia Minor. These sovereigns, sensitive to Greek culture, maintain close relations with prestigious sanctuaries, including that of Athena in Athens. Ambassadors and pilgrims from Asia Minor regularly arrive at the port of Piraeus to then climb the Acropolis. The Parthenon is not merely a cult center. It also becomes a diplomatic site where alliances and friendships are negotiated, symbolized by sumptuous offerings. The Attalid kings, in particular, express their devotion by occasionally dedicating statues or commemorative steles, thereby strengthening spiritual and political ties between Pergamon and Athens. For visitors discovering this legendary monument, the sight of its majestic columns evokes the past grandeur of Pericles' century. During the 3rd century before Christ and the first half of the 2nd, Athens sometimes found itself embroiled in the wars between the Hellenistic kingdoms. The Macedonian, Seleucid, and Egyptian rivals fought for control of trade routes and strategic cities. Yet, the spiritual prestige of the Parthenon remained intact. The Panathenea, a festival in honor of Athena, continued to gather music competitions, athletic events, and solemn processions. Wealthy Athenian families, eager to perpetuate a centuries-old tradition, financed the creation of the peplos for the goddess and participated in organizing sacred banquets. At the same time, some Hellenistic rulers, vying in generosity, made one-time donations to contribute to the restoration or embellishment of the sanctuary. As political tension grew in the region, the city tried to maintain diplomatic relations with different kingdoms, seeking to ensure the safety of its cultural heritage. Athenian emissaries traveled across the Aegean Sea, negotiating treaties that ensured the neutrality of the sacred site. Despite frequent changes in alliances, the Parthenon continued to symbolize a collective pride, beyond partisan divides. By the mid-2nd century before Christ, Rome's rising influence in Greek affairs opened a new era, but Athens still strived to preserve its emblematic temple. In 146, before Christ, the Achaean League was defeated by the Roman Republic, sealing the end of the political autonomy of mainland Greece. Athens, rich in its cultural heritage, maintained considerable prestige in the eyes of the conquerors. The Parthenon, a sanctuary dedicated to Athena, retained a major role in religious life, even if its status evolved under Roman oversight. Local institutions remained active, as Rome practiced a policy of respect towards indigenous cults. The Temple of Athena slowly transformed, adopting a new duality, a sacred place and an artistic showcase. As Rome extended its influence, Athens retained the ability to celebrate its religious festivals. The Panathenea persisted, even if Roman magistrates closely monitored the use of public funds. In this context, the Parthenon embodied past grandeur and a civic identity still valued. In parallel, the elites allied with Roman representatives to safeguard local interests. This special status partly rested on the fascination exerted by Greek culture. Roman education was imbued with Hellenistic philosophy and art, strengthening Athenian influence and preserving its prominence. The rise of Octavian, who became the first Roman emperor under the name Augustus in 27 before Christ, brought a new era of stability to the empire. Within the framework of Lex Provinciae, each conquered region benefited from a regulation adapted to its situation while remaining subject to Roman authority. Athens then enjoyed a notable privilege. Augustus, a proponent of an enlightened government, protected the cults and encouraged the maintenance of a peaceful climate. The Parthenon, a prominent symbol of the city's glorious past, benefited from this official tolerance. Ceremonies in honor of Athena persisted, granting the edifice a prestigious status, a blend of devotion and imperial respect. The Roman presence, however, influenced the temple's initial function. Imperial representatives sometimes gathered at the Parthenon to view the artistic treasures, admiring sculptures and friezes with an almost archaeological interest. Processions of ambassadors could be received there, while great Roman figures passing through Athens appreciated the splendor of this sanctuary. It was not uncommon for patrons to support the erection of honorary statues within the sacred precinct, illustrating the will to reconcile Greek polytheistic tradition with the display of Roman power. The Parthenon gradually became a temple museum, a showcase of an idealized Hellas and a pan-Hellenic symbol. Later, under the reign of Hadrian from 117-138 Anno Domini, Athens experienced a new lease on life, marked by an ambitious program of construction and restoration. The emperor, known for his Philhellenism, invested heavily in the city, commissioning public laundries, libraries, and forums. Near the Parthenon, he ordered the erection of an Odeon, a building designed for concerts and lectures, demonstrating his desire to promote the cultural life of Athens. Hadrian also had certain sections of the temple repaired, which had been damaged by wear and the erosion of time. The columns, subjected to climatic variations, received reinforcements, and the pediments preserved their reliefs, thanks to targeted interventions. This constructive fervor went hand in hand with financial support. Besides his assistance in the refurbishment of the Parthenon structures, Hadrian commissioned new statues dedicated to Athena and various legendary heroes. These works, often signed by Greek sculptors, maintained artistic excellence. The sculptors were inspired by the classical traditions of the 5th century before Christ, attempting to revive the splendor of an idealized era. Meanwhile, the presence of Roman craftsmen specializing in cutting and transporting marble blocks facilitated large-scale works. The Pentelic marbles were transported from the nearby quarries, while the imperial logistics ensured a smooth supply. The traveler and geographer Pausanias, active in the 2nd century Anno Domini, provides a valuable account of the state of the Parthenon during this period. During his journey through Greece, he meticulously describes the buildings, cults, and votive treasures. Regarding the Parthenon, he records the still intact presence of ornamental sculptures, notably mentioning the majestic golden shield adorning the statue of Athena, placed in the cella. According to some accounts, this shield retained traces of a lightning strike, a dark band testifying to a celestial event, interpreted by pilgrims as a sign of divine power. According to Pausanias, the temple continues to receive offerings from various areas, as Athena remains a respected deity among both Greeks and some Romans intrigued by local mythology. The interior walls still house paintings or votive panels, vestiges of a long tradition of public piety. Pausanias also notes the location of reliefs dedicated to the goddess's great deeds, such as the Gigantomachy and other epic tales. The fluidity of exchanges within the empire favors the movement of educated elites, who come to Athens to better understand the roots of classical culture. The Parthenon, at the heart of these discoveries, embodies a place of wonder. Thus, under the Antonines, the prosperity of the 2nd century is reflected in the continuous maintenance of the complex. The Roman authorities, mindful of their Greek heritage, did not hesitate to fund the restoration of certain parts of the sculpted decor. Craftsmen traveled through the sanctuary to consolidate fragile blocks while preserving as much as possible the finesse of the reliefs. Missing parts, sometimes damaged due to earthquakes or minor degradations, were carefully replaced. This attention to artistic integrity extends the temple's reputation as a reference point where scholars and travelers come to admire the living relics of the past. However, the relative tranquility of this period crumbled during the 3rd century Anno Domini, when the Roman Empire went through a series of economic, political, and military crises. The Sarmatian Wars, conducted in the Danubian regions, mobilized significant reserves in men and resources. The emperors, faced with successive invasions, primarily focused on strengthening the defensive lines and pacifying the northern borders. In this uncertain climate, Greece, although far from the first battlefields, could no longer receive sustained attention from the central power, and the credits allocated to major public buildings dwindled. The eastern provinces, including the province of Achaia, are nevertheless exposed to various incursions. Some populations from the edges of Europe take advantage of the overall weakening to launch sporadic attacks. The defenses of Athens remain in place, but financial resources allocated to the maintenance of heritage are dwindling. Inside the city, the Parthenon begins to show the first signs of structural deterioration without losing its aura. Cracks appear on the steps of the stylobate, and some marble plates come apart around the metopes, foretelling that the era of major restorations is in clear decline. It is also in the 3rd century that the first intentional mutilations of sculptures on the site are reported. Though sources remain fragmentary, there is occasional mention of groups of foreigners, travelers, or looters damaging some bas-reliefs, perhaps to seize precious materials. It is also possible that in a context of nascent religious tensions, acts of vandalism target representations deemed pagan, well before the establishment of Christianity as the official cult. Damaged inscriptions, broken facial fragments betray a more turbulent climate, where the Parthenon is no longer systematically preserved by imperial authority. Roman officials sometimes attempt to react, and local garrisons receive orders to guard the main sanctuaries, trying to prevent thefts or damage. Nevertheless, forces are reduced, and the unstable geopolitics prevent optimal deployment. Various archaeological testimonies attest that some panels of the decor were already removed or exposed to external aggressions, as shattered marble stocks are found in the immediate vicinity of the Acropolis. The urban administration, lacking sufficient funds, does not undertake a general restoration project, restricting its interventions to occasional repairs. They often only prop up blocks or wall up breaches without any aesthetic ambition. Despite these difficulties, the Parthenon retains symbolic appeal. Isolated travelers from Asia Minor or the Syrian provinces report that they can still admire the temple's general structure and discern many sculpted details. Writings from this period suggest that, even partially damaged, the decorations inspire a feeling of admiration tinged with regret. The first Christian authors, who are starting to be heard, sometimes see in it a surpassing magnificence, while recognizing the constructive ingenuity of their predecessors. Thus, the edifice traverses the century, suffering the ravages of time and conflicts, but without entirely losing awareness of its historical and religious importance. When the Eastern Roman Empire increasingly openly adopts Christianity as the official religion, many pagan temples are gradually transformed or demolished to make way for the worship of Christ. In Athens, the Parthenon, once a sanctuary dedicated to the goddess Athena, does not escape this decisive turning point in history. In the first half of the 5th century, Emperor Theodosius II, who reigns from 402 to 450, promulgates in 438 a famous decree banning pagan sacrifices and ordering the implementation of an increasingly coercive policy towards still active polytheistic cults. This legal text, sometimes referred to as the Theodosian Code, marks the beginning of a vast campaign of sanctuary closures and the conversion of old temples into churches, a phenomenon that affects the entire Mediterranean basin. In the case of the Parthenon, the formal prohibition of sacrificing to Greek gods leads to a symbolic change with heavy consequences. The gradual closure of the sanctuary of Athena Polias, where religious ceremonies, offerings, and processions had been perpetuated for centuries. The imperial authorities, supported by the local episcopate, see in this place a potential for spiritual conversion. At the beginning of the 6th century, while the city of Athens is part of the Eastern Roman Empire, often called the Byzantine Empire, the building is disaffiliated from its initial function and dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Thus, the Acropolis, once the heart of paganism, begins its transformation into a Christian stronghold. At that time, the idea of assimilating the city's tutelary goddess, Athena, with the Mother of God was not new in the minds of some believers. It was seen as a symbolic extension. Just as Athena protected the city, the Virgin Mary became the protector of the Athenian faithful, embodying divine wisdom and benevolent salvation. The local faithful, many already converted to Christianity under imperial policy, began to frequent the Parthenon, transformed into a church commonly known as the Church of Parthenos Maria, which literally means Church of the Virgin Mary. This semantic shift facilitated the religious transition and anchored a new devotion attached to this famous place. Transforming a pagan temple into a church first required major renovations. The original plan of the Parthenon, built on a stylobate surrounded by Doric columns and once housing the chryselephantine statue of Athena, had to gradually conform to the liturgical requirements of Christian worship. The first renovations, dated between the late 5th and early 6th centuries, saw the addition of an eastern apse, a standard architectural element in Christian basilicas, serving as the choir where the clergy stood. The main doors, previously arranged to lead pagan worshippers to the cella, were walled up or transformed to create a new circulation path suited to the Eucharist and other Christian rites. The interior space was reoriented. It was no longer the center of the pagan naos that was sacred, but the area of the apse where the altar was located. Thus, a very concrete spatial Christianization can be observed, expressed in the reorganization of procession routes and the highlighting of iconography now centered on Christ and the Virgin. Byzantine frescoes, some traces of which still remain today, gradually covered the interior walls. They erased or masked earlier decorations, sometimes already mutilated by time or by iconoclasts, who saw in the pagan representations an idolatrous vestige. Historical sources mention narrative scenes from the life of the Virgin and Christ, painted to instruct illiterate believers, but also to affirm the triumph of the Christian faith over fallen paganism. These frescoes, often located on the vault or above the apse, fit into the Byzantine tradition, which favors a hieratic aesthetic with elongated figures, golden backgrounds, and solemn gestures. Local artisans, sometimes trained in Constantinople or other major Christian centers, left their mark on what was once a jewel of ancient Greek sculpture. Simultaneously, the toponymy evolved, and the Acropolis became a site dedicated to prayer and pilgrimage. The arrival is reported, perhaps in the 7th century, of a relic presented as the Holy Thorn, claimed to come from the crown of thorns placed on Christ's head during his passion. This relic, whose authenticity cannot be verified by our contemporary standards, nonetheless sparked a strong devotion across the empire. The faithful flocked to venerate this symbol of Christ's suffering, which they associated with the Virgin's protective power. As the relic's renown spread, the Church of Parthenos Maria attracted pilgrims from Asia Minor, the Balkans, and even beyond. In this context, the city of Athens, although in decline compared to its classical golden age, regained a certain religious dynamism thanks to the influx of these believers seeking graces and miracles. The income generated by offerings, donations, and the sanctuary's attendance strengthened the economic and spiritual power of the Bishop of Athens, who became one of the influential figures in the region. Synods and assemblies of clerics could take place in the adjacent rooms, while the faithful circulated under the ancient columns, reinvested with new sacredness. The old altars, once dedicated to Athena, were either demolished or consecrated to the celebration of the Eucharist, sealing the break with polytheistic traditions. Over the centuries, particularly between the 7th and 9th centuries, several episodes of instability rocked the region, including barbarian invasions, internal conflicts in the Byzantine Empire, and the iconoclastic crises that shook the church. Yet, despite these disturbances, the Church of the Parthenos Maria remained an anchoring point for the local population. Successive emperors, even during the iconoclastic controversy, generally avoided destroying this historic church, sometimes preferring to erase or repaint certain images deemed contrary to imperial decrees. The result was an artistic patchwork where various pictorial phases overlapped. Specific Marian ceremonies, such as processions in honor of the Theotokos, the Byzantine title for the Virgin Mary, meaning literally she who gives birth to God, gradually replaced ancient pagan festivals. Some ecclesiastical documents mention the holding of cathedral chapters within the Parthenon, which at certain periods served as a cathedral for the Bishop of Athens. Bells, still rare in Byzantium before the 9th century, were gradually introduced, marking the Christian liturgy with new sounds resonating among the columns. Outside, on the Acropolis or in the lower city, the faithful sometimes gathered at night to keep vigil in honor of the Virgin, as at dawn, the light from the east illuminated the apse of the transformed Parthenon, recalling the ancient orientation of the temple toward the rising sun, now infused with Christian significance. This long period, spanning nearly 5 centuries, is marked by a gradual and continuous appropriation of the monument. The pagan sculptures that survived the initial Christianization were often covered with lime, broken, or concealed. The exterior Doric columns remained in place because they did not hinder the practice of worship, but the interior underwent drastic modifications to conform to ecclesiastical standards. It is likely that some of the ornamental marbles of the temple, including certain reliefs or metopes, deemed too explicit in their mythological depictions, were removed or destroyed. However, the general shape of the building, thanks to its imposing structure, survived through different eras, while the edifice imposed itself as a sacred place at the heart of a city that was no longer the powerful ancient city-state, but a regional center devoted to Christian piety. The pictorial decor itself is almost a palimpsest. In some accounts of Byzantine travelers or local chroniclers, Marian frescoes are mentioned as partially covering bas-relief sculptures, sometimes still visible under the layer of plaster. The triumphal arches of the temple, reworked, served as supports for representations of Christ Pantocrator or the Virgin in majesty. Occasionally, mosaics, typical of Byzantine art, were installed on the internal walls, but without matching the scale of the great basilicas of Constantinople or Thessaloniki. Athens was no longer an economic and artistic center, but retained enough prestige to be considered a respected Marian sanctuary. Among the spiritual attractions of the place, the relic of the Holy Thorn occupies a privileged position. Ecclesiastical documents from the 8th and 9th centuries sometimes mention this relic, emphasizing its miraculous virtues, such as the healing of chronic illnesses or the protection of the city from foreign enemies. It is reported, for example, that in times of siege or famine, the relic was exposed in the apse before the crowd of supplicant faithful in the hope of divine intervention. Hagiographical accounts depict bishops brandishing the thorn during processions around the walls of Athens, seeking to ward off the threat of Avar or Slavic raids. Although these texts are sometimes imbued with legends, they testify to the fervent faith in Marian protection, which added to the sacred aura of the Byzantine Parthenon. Cathedral chapters established within the Parthenon give rise to ecclesiastical deliberations, sometimes recorded in the archives, where liturgical questions, church land management, or relations with Constantinople are discussed. Athens' prestige is limited at this time, but the ecclesiastical institution benefits from the renown conferred by this converted, ancient monument. Bishops, often appointed by the emperor or the Patriarch of Constantinople, strive to maintain good relations with local civil authorities so that the church's properties continue to be protected. In official letters or homilies, reference is sometimes made to the new wisdom of Parthenos Maria, echoing the former goddess of wisdom, Athena. This reinterpretation of ancient symbolism consolidates the spiritual authority of the bishop and enhances the image of the Parthenon as a sanctified edifice. Between the 9th and the 11th centuries, a period marked by Byzantine dynasties such as the Macedonians from 867 to 1056 and the Ducas from 1059 to 1081, the city of Athens remains in the shadow of other major centers, but the continuity of the Church of the Parthenos Maria is assured. Some religious documents, including Typica, which are monastic regulations and synodal acts, mention the presence of canons or clerics established on the Acropolis. It is possible that monastic dependencies form around the Parthenon, especially to serve the pilgrimage activity related to the relic. Collections and offerings made to the Virgin partly ensure the maintenance of the aging structures. One can imagine that these resources provide a continuous religious life, even if the majority of citizens now live in the lower city, at the foot of the sacred hill. The Parthenon, thus integrated into the network of Byzantine churches, gradually aligns with the trends of Marian worship in the empire. Liturgical festivals such as the Annunciation on March 25th or the Dormition of the Virgin on August 15th are celebrated there with solemnity, attracting processions climbing the slope of the Acropolis. Inside, the construction of an iconostasis, partitioning the altar area, is likely as early as the High Byzantine periods, in order to separate the choir reserved for priests from the nave, where the congregation stands. This liturgical barrier, often made of precious wood and adorned with icons, is part of the Byzantine tradition and definitively marks the Christianization of the space. However, the transformation does not completely erase the pagan heritage. Byzantine historians such as Michael Psellos in the 11th century or anonymous chroniclers sometimes take pleasure in recalling that Athens was once the homeland of great philosophers, lawmakers, and artists. They describe the Acropolis as a place steeped in ancient glory, now sanctified by the cult of the Mother of God. It happens that learned scholars rediscover ancient texts, highlighting the remarkable continuity of knowledge even if the official spirit remains staunchly Christian. In some ecclesiastical histories, one finds the idea of spiritual lineage. From pagan wisdom to Christian wisdom, Athens is said to have paved the way for a higher understanding, now personified by the Virgin Mary. This theological view of antiquity underlines the complexity of the Christianization process, which combines legislative repression, architectural appropriation, and symbolic reinterpretation. During these centuries, the Parthenon certainly remains one of the most important heritage jewels in the region, even if its ancient splendor has been partially altered by liturgical interventions. The Pentelic marbles retain their whiteness, despite the patina of time, while the wall frescoes and perhaps some mosaics gradually transform the interior into a properly Byzantine sacred space. Art historians hypothesize that it also featured ex-votos offered by grateful pilgrims, hung near the relic of the Holy Thorn or placed in wall niches. Some could have been made of precious metal, which would inevitably attract covetousness during periods of political turmoil or invasions. The ecclesiastical authorities then protect these treasures as best as they can, knowing that the sanctuary's prestige depends on the preservation of its sacred riches. The cult of the Virgin, which became central in Byzantine piety, ensured the building a major role for Marian celebrations. The bishops of Athens certainly dedicate a significant part of their ministry to the maintenance of the monument and to welcoming pilgrims. It is likely that new developments, such as small adjacent chapels, are constructed to meet the growth of the local Christian community or to house additional relics. Documentation is scarce, but it is assumed that donations and investments were proportional to the spiritual status of the place, especially since the Virgin Parthenos, equated with the Mother of God, aligned perfectly with the doctrinal tone of the empire, proud of its Orthodox heritage. Some accounts report that the church was decorated with silver lamps and candlesticks offered by notables, and even that a clerical library, containing both theological writings and ancient philosophical works, existed in an annex. Cultured bishops or deacons could consult treatises there to enrich their homilies, perhaps reinterpreting Plato, Aristotle, or Plotinus in the light of the Christian faith. This cultural blending, though discreet, was part of a long Athenian tradition. Sometimes, religious discussions were organized there with itinerant monks or erudite visitors, reinforcing the idea that Athens remained in a way the city of wisdom, now transfigured by Christianity. This phase of Christianization of the Parthenon extends until the 11th century, during which the building retains its status as a church dedicated to the Virgin. Festive patronal celebrations likely take place there, associated with processions and sung services. The role of a protective structure, once belonging to the goddess Athena, is now fully assumed by the Mother of God. Greek inscriptions found in some corners of the structure mention dedications to the Theotokos, attesting to the continuity of this cult. When the Crusader armies seized Athens at the very beginning of the 13th century, they were looking to establish new territories in the weakened Byzantine Empire. It was 1205, just a year after Constantinople was taken by the Western barons of the Fourth Crusade, and the geopolitical situation was in full mutation. At that time, the Crusaders, primarily from France, Burgundy, and other regions of Central Europe, organized to consolidate their control over Greece and create various principalities. Athens, still infused with its ancient splendor, falls under the authority of Othon de la Roche, a Burgundian noble who becomes the first lord of the city. Thus, the Duchy of Athens is born, dominated by these Latin lords who settle in the city and strive to reshape the religious topography of the area. Their impact on the Acropolis of Athens is considerable and immediately felt in the configuration of the major monument. The structure that the Latins discover on the Acropolis has already undergone successive transformations over previous periods. In the eyes of these new masters, the main building, once dedicated to the goddess Athena, now holds a different strategic and religious value. In their desire to impose their practices and their Catholic faith, they undertake the conversion of the building into a cathedral dedicated to the divine wisdom, naming it Saint Sophie, thus continuing the Byzantine tradition that already venerated Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. However, the location and internal layout differ greatly from the great imperial basilica, and the Western artisans must work with pre-existing elements. These modifications give the whole a hybrid aspect, blending the ancient past, Byzantine heritage, and Romanesque contributions. The Franks, conscious of the monument's radiant symbolism, also encouraged the construction of new spaces to organize their Latin worship. The title of Duke of Athens, conferred upon Otto de la Roche, symbolizes Frankish domination, but it also entails considerable cultural and political reconfigurations. Settled in the fortress of the Acropolis, Otto considers himself a feudal prince, as he rules over a territory extending beyond the ancient city, encompassing vast countryside and strategic towns. To legitimize his power, this lord invests in enhancing the former sacred area, now converted into an ecclesiastical seat. The Latin offices, often celebrated with great pomp, mark a turning point in the daily life of the Athenians who remained, as they discover a liturgy and rites different from those of the Orthodox Church. The Frankish influence also manifests in administration, justice, and tax collection, redirecting local resources towards the new ruling power. Despite some resistance, the Cathedral of St. Sophia quickly becomes an identity landmark for the Western minority. From the early years of the Frankish government, the most visible project remains the architectural transformation. Although we do not have complete original plans, travelers' accounts and later documents report the construction of a Gothic bell tower erected on the southwest corner of the main building. This tower, of Western inspiration, starkly contrasts with the Byzantine style of Athens and stands as a marker of Latin authority. The master builders, imported from regions accustomed to such constructions, ensure the foundations are adapted to the peculiarities of the Acropolis rock and the materials available on site. The insertion of ribs, pointed arches, and buttresses aligns with the religious function, while emphasizing the ambition of the new lords to endow the cathedral with an appearance more familiar to Western nobles. Statues of saints and gargoyles might have adorned this bell tower, though there are few tangible archaeological clues to confirm it. The adoption of the name Saint Sophia represents a highly symbolic gesture, uniting the Byzantine imperial tradition with the nascent Latin identity. The Franciscan and Dominican clerics, often sent from Italy, play a crucial role in pastoral organization. They establish new sacraments while striving to rally the local Greek population. Despite doctrinal differences and tensions between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, some forms of cultural coexistence emerge, notably through the commissioning of frescoes or icons intended to adorn the walls of the new cathedral. Nevertheless, Frankish elites remain somewhat mistrustful of the Greek clergy, sometimes associating them with the fallen power of the Byzantine Empire. Ceremonies organized in this cathedral gradually transform the city's festive calendar, imposing Latin celebrations that overlap or compete with former Orthodox processions, now relegated to secondary churches. In 1208, a particular event draws attention to the newly consecrated cathedral, the princely marriage of Otto de la Roche himself. According to chronicles of the time, the ceremony takes place in the cella, the former sacred inner part of the ancient temple, now converted into the main nave for Latin worship. It is a solemn moment, interweaving the feudal pomp from the west with the historical majesty of the site. Latin dignitaries, dressed in their finest attire, attend the celebration and pronounce mutual vows of loyalty. Chants resonate under the improvised vaults of the old cella, while the light, filtered through hastily added stained glass windows, imparts a sacred and chivalrous aura to the scene. Many Frankish officers, allies, and vassals of Otto participate, thus reinforcing the image of a duchy in full political expansion. The choice to celebrate a princely union in this ancient site reflects the desire to affirm the continuity between Athens' past glory and the new Frankish era. The walls, still adorned with reliefs or decorative remnants, offer an unusual setting for this Western liturgy. It is said that silk draperies from Italy were brought, along with silver jewelry pieces to adorn the temporary altar. The musicians are believed to have resonated Latin hymns, a distant echo of the ancient Greek processions. For Otto de la Roche, this moment solemnly affirms his status as the lord of the place, while proclaiming his ambition to transform Athens into a model of Western feudalism on Greek soil. While few sources precisely describe the reaction of the Greek inhabitants, some writings suggest a fascination mixed with perplexity at this rapid appropriation of a site whose renown spans millennia. Beyond the anecdote of the wedding, the Latin and Frankish period in Attica extends until the mid-15th century, characterized by a superposition of influences from the West and local traditions. The Cathedral of St. Sophia, the spiritual center of the duchy, becomes the stage for other significant events, such as military investitures, official proclamations, and solemn masses in honor of visiting knights. Successive dukes strive to consolidate their authority by reinforcing the city's defenses and maintaining good relations with other Latin powers established in the region, whether it be the Prince of Achaia or the Sovereign of Thessaloniki. During these decades, the Acropolis remains more than ever a symbol of power. The presence of the Gothic bell tower and the maintenance of the Latin Rite attest to the continuous will to visibly mark Frankish sovereignty while coexisting with the Orthodox majority. As Latin influence consolidates, Frankish families settle on the outskirts of the Acropolis, benefiting from the privileges granted by the Duke. The records of the time mention the payment of special taxes, partly used for the maintenance of the Cathedral of St. Sophia and the remuneration of Latin clergy. In this context, ecclesiastical life experiences significant growth. Bishops from the Roman clergy, dependent on the papacy, convene synods to regulate the discipline of the diocese. Marriage procedures, rules of succession, and diplomatic alliances henceforth pass through the filter of Latin canonical law, gradually transforming the Athenian social fabric. Greek artisans, skilled in stone carving or mosaic making, are solicited to work on the ornamentation of the cathedral, although the dominant aesthetic remains influenced by the West. Some historians suggest that during the 14th century, a Latin scriptoria workshop might have existed near the sanctuary, producing illuminated manuscripts combining Western motifs and Byzantine tradition. Fragmentary archives report pious donations, charitable foundations, and lay confraternities keen on spreading the Roman faith on Greek territory. On feast days, solemn processions cross the city to reach the cathedral, while banners adorned with crosses testify to the symbolic hold Latins had over the city. At the heart of these processions, the figure of the Duke remains omnipresent, attesting that Latin sovereignty extends beyond the political sphere and is rooted in the sacred. The Ottoman conquest of Athens in 1458, shortly after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, radically transforms the destiny of the Parthenon, a monument already modified multiple times since its foundation in the 5th century before Christ. Until then converted into a church under Latin domination, the edifice now becomes a mosque to meet the cultic needs of the new Muslim masters. Sultan Mehmed II, victorious, intends to assert the preeminence of Islam in this prestigious city that was once the heart of ancient Greek civilization. To materialize this new religious function, a minaret rises in the southwest corner of the temple, overlooking the entire Acropolis. This minaret, admittedly more modest than those found in other cities of the empire, nevertheless embodies the Ottoman presence. Inside, a mihrab is installed facing Mecca, and the nave, cleared of its ecclesiastical furnishings, now accommodates prayer rugs covering the floor. Beyond simple interior design, the creation of an ablution fountain complements the essential facilities for religious life. Worshippers must purify themselves before each prayer, according to Islamic tradition, and a water source is set up near the temple or directly within its enclosure. Chroniclers of the time often mention this basin, whether it was of a sobriety in line with Ottoman aesthetics, limited to a reservoir and a few pipes, or more elaborate, with a small stone construction providing the necessary water. The whole attests to the authorities' desire to perpetuate their right in this space, without disrupting the architectural integrity of the ancient building, whose Doric style and age-old majesty can still be perceived. Thus, the Parthenon, now a mosque, remains at the center of local spiritual life, while preserving under its lime the traces of its Christian and polytheistic past. This religious pragmatism is coupled with a military demand. The Acropolis constitutes an impregnable natural fortress, and the Ottomans intend to exploit this strategic advantage. From the moment the garrison is installed, the Parthenon serves as a storage place for various supplies, including gunpowder. The interior rooms, once dedicated to the worship of Athena, now house barrels, weapons, and various equipment intended to defend the city against enemy incursions. One might wonder why these munitions are stored in the heart of such a prestigious monument, but the need to hold the position then outweighs respect for heritage. Over time, this accumulation of powder increases as each convoy replenishes the fortified area. The risks of explosion, very real, seem underestimated as the Parthenon, massive and reputedly almost invulnerable, gives the illusion of being resistant to any bombardment. In this context, the testimony of Evliya Çelebi, a 17th century Ottoman traveler and scholar, proves invaluable. A great curiosity in architecture and local traditions himself, he travels the empire and describes Athens under the name of Setine, referring to a uniquely beautiful building, which he calls Temple-i Bahira. He still observes Byzantine frescoes, incompletely covered with lime, adorning certain walls of the former church. While he does not detail the precise state of each sculpture, he notes nevertheless the presence of ancient motifs on blocks embedded in the wall or set in the ground. His account reflects the mix of fascination and pride that the Ottomans feel facing this architectural jewel, now appropriated by Islam. While recognizing the military role of the fortress, he insists on the persistent sacredness of the place, where prayer resonates among multi-millennial columns, evoking the past glory of Athena and the Christian piety relegated to the background. For the Ottoman administration, concerned with controlling trade routes between Europe and the East, Athens remains a secondary passage compared to the great Aegean ports. Nevertheless, the city retains a unique aura, and the Acropolis, as a powerful fortress, holds crucial defensive importance. The Venetian armies, in recurrent conflict with the sultans, periodically seek to seize strategic points to cut Ottoman communications. In this rivalry, the Parthenon plays a key role. It houses the powder reserve, allowing soldiers to maintain a decisive advantage during sieges. Reports from that time reveal that Ottoman officers fear an enemy shot, capable of triggering a cataclysmic explosion. However, belief in the ancient solidity of the building often prevails over caution, and the command is content to reinforce fortifications without ever fully evacuating the munitions, citing the lack of alternative storage places that are sufficiently secure. In the center of the sanctuary, the coexistence of religious function and military use astonishes some Western visitors. They recount how, on great festival days, the faithful bow in prayer in the nave, while guards circulate around barrels stacked against the walls, ready to ward off any external threat. Chronicles report the singular ambience that reigns at such times. On one side, spirituality expressed by the muezzin calling to prayer from atop the minaret. On the other, the anxiety born of potential clashes with a formidable adversary. Despite these tensions, the Parthenon Mosque remains a symbol of prestige for the Ottomans on Greek soil. Its location offers a panoramic view, spanning Attica to the sea, and confirms Constantinople's mastery over the conquered territories. Paradoxically, this same dominant position makes it a prime target for potential assailants. Over the course of the 17th century, the rivalry between Venice and the Sublime Porte intensified, particularly around the control of Crete and other strategic positions in the eastern Mediterranean. In this tense climate, Athens remains a relatively calm garrison until the Holy League, led by Doge Francesco Morosini, plans to attack the fortress in 1687. The Venetian preparations involve subjecting the city to an intensive siege. Artillery is positioned on nearby heights, fully aware of the presence of gunpowder within the Parthenon's walls. The objective is clear: force Ottoman surrender or induce a moral collapse within the garrison. The Ottomans, entrenched behind the walls, rely on the legendary robustness of the Acropolis and the difficulties the assailants will face in accessing it. However, this confidence clashes with the Venetian determination to strike at the military and religious heart of the city. The first shots of Venetian artillery hit the surroundings of the Acropolis at the end of summer 1687. The close impacts shake the ramparts and cause the ground to tremble even within the mosque, where a few faithful persist in praying despite the danger. Historians report that, in the confusion, some of Athens' inhabitants attempt to take refuge at the foot of the rock or flee the city, while the garrison prepares to withstand a long siege. According to some sources, bomb fragments already graze the roof of the Parthenon, shattering a few sculptures and causing the first collapses. Ottoman officers clearly discern the peril that a shell hitting the stored barrels would represent, but they have no fallback solution. The few places that could serve as shelters are already saturated, and moving the munitions amid bombardment appears unfeasible. Tension rises, and everyone dreads the worst. When, on September 26, 1687, a Venetian projectile strikes the cella directly, the impact is devastating. Flame erupts upon contact with the barrels, triggering an explosion so violent that it shakes the entire Acropolis. The roof of the Parthenon collapses under the blast, hurling marble and debris onto the surroundings. Archives describe a deafening noise, followed by a thick cloud of smoke enveloping the hill before dispersing over the Athenian plain. Inside the mosque, the explosion claims countless victims, soldiers and civilians alike, trapped at the heart of the inferno. The centuries-old pillars break, the walls open, and large sections of the frieze or metopes crumble into unrecognizable fragments. Although the Ottomans attempt to resist further, the destruction of the powder depot definitively undermines their morale. Some accounts claim that, even from afar, the blaze consuming the roof can be seen. In the Venetian camp, there is congratulation for having hit the main target, without fully realizing the extent of the damage to the ancient heritage. The following days confirm the catastrophe. Monumental blocks litter the ground. The cella is no more than a heap of rubble, and the iconic silhouette of the Parthenon is forever altered, a silent witness to the perils that war imposes on the greatest masterpieces. Inscriptions also report that, amidst this chaos, several manuscripts and ritual objects disappear, further aggravating the cultural loss caused by this explosion. On September 26, 1687, as part of the larger conflict of the Holy League, the capital of Attica is caught in a whirlwind of naval and land battles between the Republic of Venice and the Ottoman forces still occupying the city of Athens. At that time, the Holy League brought together several Christian powers, including Venice, determined to contain the expansion of the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean basin. The Venetians, led by General Francesco Morosini, are conducting a campaign aimed at taking the city, a symbolic and strategic key of the region. The hills of Philopappus, located to the southwest of the Acropolis, offer the Venetian gunners an ideal vantage point for bombarding the sacred rock without too much exposure to Ottoman counterattacks. From their commanding position, the Venetian cannons aimed at the Acropolis herald one of the most tragic turning points in the history of the Parthenon. For the majestic structure admired for centuries is suddenly struck head-on by a disastrous shell. The famous Doric colonnade, erected under the direction of architects Iktinos and Kallikrates in the 5th century before Christ, still dominates the city, but its walls then house a powder magazine installed by the Ottomans. Over the years, the Parthenon had transitioned from a temple dedicated to the goddess Athena to a Christian church and then to a mosque during the Ottoman conquest. For tactical reasons, the Turkish army, defending the stronghold, has stored munitions and supplies in the building. At the moment when the Venetian batteries concentrate their fire, the impact on this powder magazine is inevitable if a projectile explodes at the heart of the sanctuary, turned into an arsenal. On this fateful day, a shell penetrates the roof of the Parthenon and triggers an explosion of extraordinary violence. Witnesses report a deafening detonation, followed by a plume of smoke and flames that sets the Athenian night ablaze. The explosion rips open the internal structure of the building and causes the collapse of a significant portion of the roof. The celi, these sacred spaces that once housed the colossal statue of Athena Parthenos, are reduced to a heap of rubble. In the moments that follow, the metopes on the south side, already weakened by the wear of time and successive manipulations, are pulverized or fall heavily. Many of these reliefs, depicting grand mythological scenes like the Amazonomachy or the Centauromachy, sustain irreversible damage, carrying away with them an invaluable slice of Greek classical art. Amidst this chaos, the Venetian army rushes towards the sacred rock to consolidate its positions and inspect the results of its bombardment. The Ottomans, entrenched within the walls of the Acropolis, are forced to retreat after this catastrophe that severely weakens their defense. Despite the consternation caused by the destruction of an iconic monument, from a military perspective, the explosion represents a success for the Republic of Venice, which sees the Ottoman defenses gravely damaged. However, the Venetians soon realize that an opportunity presents itself to recover some remarkable elements of the Parthenon sculpture, notably the famous pediment horses. These horses, sculpted in marble, likely representing the divine race of Helios and Selene, have always intrigued visitors with their vitality and finesse of execution. Francesco Morosini, soon nicknamed the Moor of the Morea for his campaigns in the Peloponnese Peninsula known as Morea by the Venetians, then orders his officers to undertake the dismantling of these sculptural elements. The idea is to transport them to Venice as trophies, somewhat like what happened during the Crusades when Byzantine artworks ended up in the Venetian capital and were displayed in St. Mark's Square. The desire to glorify the Republic of Venice and prove the superiority of its arms is thus manifested by this attempt to appropriate the most prestigious fragments of the temple, already ravaged by cannonades and the explosion. To carry out this project, soldiers and craftsmen are called upon, tasked with stretching ropes and pulleys to unseal the remaining blocks from the pediment. One can easily imagine the difficulty of this operation. The Parthenon is already nothing more than a partially smoldering field of rubble, where thick clouds of dust and ash hinder visibility. Despite the relative care given to these relics, the weakened structure threatens to collapse further with every vibration. The marble horses, carved from a single piece or carefully fitted parts, remain very delicate to extract without breaking them. The Venetians, focused on the prestige such loot would bring, try their luck, ignorant of the ultimate fragility of these artistic pieces. According to consistent accounts, the first maneuvers end in a crushing failure. One of the pediment pieces crashes to the ground after becoming too abruptly detached, causing dismay among the officers and soldiers. Additional fragments break, nullifying the effort made to seize a majestic testament of Athens' past. Seeing the difficulty of the operation, the Venetians eventually decide to halt the attempt. They indeed fear sacrificing even more sculptures without any guarantee of extracting intact pieces. The speed at which the situation deteriorated prompts them to give up, to avoid further wastage of a work whose symbolic value remained considerable, even fractured. At this critical moment, the city of Athens itself is suffering the consequences of the battle between the two great enemy powers. The Holy League, comprising notably the Papal States, the Holy Roman Empire, the Knights of Malta, and the Republic of Venice, tries to consolidate its grip on continental Greece, while the Ottomans, determined not to yield a vital point, fight fervently to retain the Acropolis. The Venetians, encouraged by the momentary success of the destruction of the powder store, established their position on the site, but the supreme edifice of ancient Greece has just suffered irreparable damage. The impact on cultural memory is immense. The Parthenon, a jewel of the classical age, is now pierced, shattered, and deprived of a significant part of its sculptural ornaments. The European consciousness of the time, still steeped in admiration for Greco-Roman antiquity, reacts variously to the news of the disaster. Some consider it an inevitable consequence of war, justified by the fight against the Ottoman Empire. Others, more sensitive to the historical importance of the monument, deplore the brutality of such an act, even if it results from a military strategy. Scholars and lovers of antiquities, who were already beginning to take an increasing interest in the remnants of Greece, are alarmed at the critical state of the emblematic monument of the Acropolis. Letters sent from Greece testify to this. Travelers, often Italians or French, report the scene of smoking ruins and broken sculptures, while the relentless will of the Republic of Venice to realize its military ambitions turns the scholarly world's attention to this fateful encounter. For Francesco Morosini, the capture of Athens was a way to finalize his success in Greece, but the accidental ruin of the Parthenon was never stated as a goal. The cannon barrage intended to compromise the Ottoman position certainly exceeded expectations by causing unprecedented destruction. In the months that follow, the Venetians try to assert their victory, but there are also disapproving comments regarding the extent of the damage inflicted on a common heritage. In Venice, however, the population celebrates Morosini's fame and the audacity of his army. The Republic sees in him the hero who managed to carry the confrontation into Ottoman territory, shaking the enemy's power and securing a significant success. The knights and soldiers eventually leave without the horses from the pediment, aware of the time and energy it would take to transport them, as well as the risk of further damage. They leave a dismembered Parthenon, half buried under rubble, yet they retain the intention of marking their presence. The monumental debacle leaves a lasting memory in the collective consciousness, which will now associate the name Morosini with the dramatic scene of the explosion, the shattered columns, and friezes. As church bells resonate in an Athens conquered for a time, the wounded silhouette of the Parthenon, pride of the Periclean Golden Age, remains a poignant testimony to the fragility of heritage in the face of the ravages of war. Between the end of the 17th century and the first decades of the 19th century, the Acropolis of Athens attracts the attention of an elite of travelers, scholars, and draftsmen fascinated by Greek antiquity. At this time, Europe is in intellectual turmoil, encouraged by the curiosity of the Enlightenment era and the desire to discover the remains of a legendary past. The conflicts of the period, notably the rivalries between European powers and the Ottoman occupation, complicate access to Greece, but the allure of the Acropolis remains irresistible. Artists, historians, and architects brave the difficulties to visit the sites and transcribe as faithfully as possible what remains of the Parthenon. Among the first witnesses of the Parthenon state before the 1687 catastrophe is a French artist named Jacques Carré. Although he traveled to the region in 1674, 13 years before the devastating explosion caused by the Venetian shot, his drawings now constitute the last complete visual trace of some sculpted elements. Carré, commissioned by the French ambassador in Constantinople, makes quick and precise sketches of the pediments, friezes, and certain architectural details, providing a fresh perspective on the still intact ruins. Over time, his watercolors and sketches acquire an invaluable value for historians. After the partial destruction of the building, Carré's works become an irreplaceable primary source, as they allow the reconstruction of the original appearance of monuments already damaged. Thanks to these plates, the damaged pediments still convey their mythological tales, from the birth of Athena to the scenes illustrating the rivalry between gods. Specialists in the following century will rely on this documentation to compare the ancient and modern state of the structure, while travelers embarking on the grand tour of the Mediterranean will aim to complete or correct what Carré had observed 30 years earlier. His sketches remain one of the essential bases of archaeological study. Antiquity enthusiasts, marked by the renewed interest in Greek civilization, become increasingly passionate about Athenian ruins. The Grand Tour, a cultural practice since the 18th century, offers the British and European aristocratic youth a formative itinerary, including Italy, Greece, and sometimes the Ottoman Empire. Wealthy young people aspire to immerse themselves in classical architecture, art, and literature while confronting the relics that inspire their studies. In this flow of visitors, several notable figures, such as James Stewart and Nicholas Revet, play a pioneering role in the methodical exploration of the Parthenon. James Stewart, a Scottish architect and painter, travels to Greece starting in 1751 with Nicholas Revet, an English architect. Their official objective is to take exact measurements and create records of the Athenian sites, notably on the Acropolis. The two men rely on the approval of the local Ottoman authorities to access the sites, a privilege demanding diplomatic negotiations. Besides drawings and plans, they publish upon their return a monumental work, the Antiquities of Athens, which heralds the emergence of a more rigorous archaeology, concerned with documentary precision and historical value. Over the course of these expeditions, other scholarly travelers, such as the Irishman Edward Dodwell or the Frenchman Louis-François Sébastien Fauvel, involved themselves in the detailed study of the sculptures still present on the Parthenon. Dodwell, traveling in the early 19th century, took precise notes on the condition of the metopes and friezes, while Fauvel, the French consular agent in Athens, attempted to negotiate the purchase or exportation of antique pieces, to enrich European collections. The Ottoman authorities, often insensitive to the patrimonial value of the marbles, did not always refuse, but the maneuvers remained costly and uncertain, hindering the ambitions of enthusiasts. Negotiations sometimes stretched over several months. As these explorers examined the reliefs and attempted to understand ancient construction, the practice of plaster casting grew in popularity. Creating a replica of a frieze or a capital allowed a nearly identical reproduction to be transported to Europe without disassembling the original stone. These techniques, while costly and labor-intensive, enjoyed notable success among aristocratic circles and scholarly societies, eager for faithful reproductions or examples intended for teaching. The idea of studying classical proportions would influence the training of architects, reinforcing the Parthenon's reputation as a universal model of harmony. The consolidation of this new discipline, gradually called classical archaeology, was nourished by the observations and records accumulated over the visits. Scholars attempted to classify and identify each fragment, to compare stylistic differences between Doric and Ionic elements, or to distinguish the successive contributions of different restoration eras. In European salons, the results of these findings were passionately discussed. Some argued that the Doric perfection of the Parthenon embodied a timeless ideal, while others preferred to see it as an example of almost austere sobriety, capable of being reinterpreted in the Rococo style. The collective imagination was also fed by little anecdotes gathered during these expeditions, fueling a romanticized narrative of ancient Greece. Travelers reported local legends, described Greek religious ceremonies, sometimes perceived as pagan survivals, and recorded any architectural anomaly. For example, the discovery of polychrome fragments on sculptures shook the preconceived notions that Greek art was merely immaculate white marble. Comments also addressed the emotional dimension. Contemplating the Parthenon evoked the grandeur of a vanished civilization, while reminding of the fragility of empires against time and destruction. In this context, European aesthetic criteria evolved. On one side, proponents of the Rococo taste appreciated fantasy and ornamental complexity, seeing in Greek heritage a source of graceful forms to adapt. On the other, advocates of pure classicism, particularly in England and Germany, drew inspiration from the rigor and simplicity attributed to the Doric style. Aesthetic discussions went hand in hand with a more in-depth examination of the Parthenon's proportions and the smallest structural details. Everyone projected their ideals, sometimes ignoring that the edifice had undergone numerous direct modifications over the preceding centuries. The first archaeological circles, beginning to structure themselves between Paris, London, and Rome, actively encouraged the dissemination of engravings, measured plans, and monographs on the Acropolis. Epistolary exchanges between scholars, often members of prestigious academies, allowed debates on the smallest discoveries. For example, there was excitement upon learning about the discovery of votive inscriptions or statue bases, which reignited the discussion on the ancient cults celebrated around Athena. In university circles, education was enriched with these new insights. Reports from travelers were read, measurements by Stewart and Revit were compared, and the accuracy of ancient descriptions was verified. In parallel, European artistic production is enriched by countless engravings, paintings, and stories that glorify the Parthenon. Grandiose paintings reproduce romantic views of the Acropolis, bathed in the golden light of the Mediterranean. Through these works, the Western public becomes enthusiastic about an idealized antiquity, a symbol of beauty and wisdom. Greek myths and heroes return to the forefront of theater and literature. Playwrights, poets, and musicians find a wealth of inspiration there. While the Renaissance had already valorized the Roman and Greek heritage, the 18th century delves deeper into this vein, focused on Athens as the cradle of democracy. At the turn of the 1770s and 1780s, the discovery of other major sites in Greece, such as Olympia and Delphi, intensifies the desire to understand ancient urbanism as a whole. However, the Acropolis remains the undisputed emblem, both for its tumultuous history and the majesty of the Parthenon. Engineers begin to take an interest in the construction techniques of the ancients, observing the use of carefully cut and assembled blocks without mortar. Debates on the subtle curvature of the columns and entasis, already mentioned by ancient treatises, resurface. The smallest remnants, from pieces of triglyphs to sections of secondary walls, fuel speculations about the genesis of Greek architecture. Several reviews, published at the end of the 18th century, contribute to the rise of a general enthusiasm for classical studies. The archives gather hundreds of handwritten notes and sketches, illustrating every detail of the Parthenon, from its base to its damaged roof. Although these documents are not always perfectly accurate, they provide an essential foundation for future historians, allowing them to validate or refute various hypotheses. Controversies then arise between those who hold authority, often wealthy members of the nobility, and more modest specialists, sometimes better informed, who rely on meticulous fieldwork. At the beginning of the 19th century, Europe is profoundly marked by the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte, after proclaiming himself Emperor of the French, seeks to impose his influence across the continent, while the United Kingdom, wary of this expansion, negotiates alliances to maintain the balance of power. The Ottoman Empire, then led by Sultan Selim III, sees Great Britain as a strategic support to limit the French advance. This convergence of interests leads to diplomatic agreements that grant certain British representatives expanded access to Hellenic archaeological sites. It is in this context that Thomas Bruce, the Earl of Elgin, begins his mission. Lord Elgin, born in 1766, is appointed British ambassador to Constantinople in 1799. His official objective is to strengthen political and commercial ties between London and the Sublime Porte, but he also harbors a passion for ancient art. Having recruited artists and draftsmen to record and copy the sculptures of classical Greece, he initially wishes to complete archaeological studies. However, he does not stop at simple documentation. Convinced that the preservation of these masterpieces requires their transfer to England, he seeks permission from the Ottoman authorities to dismantle certain pieces, including those of the Parthenon. In 1801, the diplomat obtains an official text often referred to as a firman, although this term remains open to interpretation. Historical sources diverge on the exact form of the document, but it seems to have been a letter patent written in Italian, the usual language of communication between the Ottoman court and Western diplomats. The terms authorize Elgin's team to be present on the Acropolis to observe, draw, and mold the sculptures. However, no explicit mention of the physical removal of the marbles is made. The ambiguous wording of the text paves the way for long disputes over the legality of the extraction. In the political climate of the time, local Ottoman authorities, concerned with maintaining good relations with the British ambassador, sometimes turn a blind eye to the actual extent of the work undertaken. Elgin's agents do not hesitate to detach blocks of frieze, unseal metopes, and dismantle several statues from the Parthenon's pediments. They extract a total of nearly 75 meters of Ionic frieze, 15 Doric metopes, and 17 sculptural figures from pediments, along with some elements from other monuments on the Acropolis. The operation requires complex logistics involving cranes, pulleys, and specialized workers, often recruited from the local populations. Transport from Athens poses significant challenges. To transport these treasures to Great Britain, they are prepared for an extremely perilous maritime journey. Italian engineer Giovanni Lucieri, hired by Lord Elgin, supervises the loading of the crates on several ships. One of them, the Mentor, sets sail in 1802, carrying part of the marbles towards Malta, a strategic stopover under British control. Unfortunately, the ship wrecks near the island of Cythera, located south of the Peloponnese. The crates containing the marbles sink into the sea, requiring long and costly diving operations to partially recover them. The expenses incurred by Elgin to carry out this transfer reach considerable amounts. The costs include not only hiring workers and renting equipment, but also the bribes necessary to secure the goodwill of local Ottoman authorities. Furthermore, the diplomat bears the enormous cost of diving campaigns aimed at retrieving the submerged sculptures after the wreck, which strains his personal fortune. At the same time that he faces financial problems, criticism intensifies in England and on the continent, with some intellectuals denouncing this operation as an act of spoliation of Greek heritage. In 1803, discussions begin in the British Parliament. Some aesthetes and politicians attempt to justify the operation by invoking the rescue of marbles threatened by Ottoman negligence. They also emphasize the artistic and educational interest represented by the installation of these ancient relics in London. The aesthetic arguments presented before the committee highlight the prestige that the British capital would gain by exhibiting masterpieces of classical Greece. Some speakers insist on the perceived superiority of English civilization for preserving and showcasing archaeological treasures, already outlining a controversial legitimization discourse. Military and diplomats also justify the undertaking by recalling the belligerent context of the time. The fear of seeing France or any other power claim these renowned sculptures reinforces the idea that England is protecting a universal cultural heritage. In this light, the alliance with the Ottoman Empire offers a unique opportunity to exfiltrate the marbles. Elgin's supporters claim that, without his intervention, the pieces might have fallen victim to plunder or even been destroyed, given the site's vulnerability in a climate of military tensions. However, they overlook the extent of the ethical debate that gradually emerges around their action. However, public reception in Great Britain remains mixed. At the dawn of the 19th century, new opinion currents sensitive to heritage and people's identity emerge. Some critics point out that the authorization granted to Lord Elgin remains ambiguous and does not fully justify the removal of the marbles. Others worry about the moral contradiction between the enlightened ideals defended by Great Britain and what appears to be an organized act of looting. Voices are raised to call for the in situ restoration of the statues, fearing that the disassembly of the temple might irreparably ruin the architectural coherence of the Parthenon. Lord Byron, English Romantic poet, stands among the most vehement detractors of this appropriation. Through his work, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, published in several cantos, he denounces the greed and pride he associates with British imperial ambitions. In Canto 2, Byron explicitly evokes Greece's fallen grandeur and the injustice of seeing its monuments stripped of their ornaments. He condemns the destruction of ancient heritage and questions the legitimacy of anyone claiming the right to transport the emblematic testimonies of a civilization whose legacy belongs to all of humanity, outside Hellenic soil. While Byron writes his raw verses, Lord Elgin, on the other hand, is going through a severe financial crisis. The enormous amounts invested in the collection and transport of the sculptures have emptied his coffers. In 1806, he returns to the United Kingdom with a firm intention to negotiate the sale of these marbles to the British state. At first, He hopes to obtain a full reimbursement of the expenses incurred, convinced that he has rendered a service to the cause of art and the cultural influence of his country. But the government, eager to avoid causing public outrage, hesitates and consults experts to assess the value of the works. Negotiations continue until 1816, when the British Parliament finally agrees to purchase the collection for the sum of £35,000 sterling. This decision provokes heated debates. Some consider the amount excessive, while others point out that it is a good deal given the priceless artistic interest of these fragments. A parliamentary committee is tasked with examining the authenticity and historical significance of the collection. The experts dispatched affirm the immeasurable value of these marbles for understanding classical art. In light of this finding, the government approves the acquisition, and the works become the public property of the United Kingdom. Once the transaction is concluded, the marbles, now known as the Elgin marbles, are transferred to the British Museum, an institution founded in 1753 to house and display collections from around the world. The curators then undertake to arrange them in special galleries, allowing the public to admire their striking details of naturalism, their finely sculpted draperies, and the dynamic movements of their mythological figures. This ensemble, which includes panels from the frieze depicting a procession, metopes showing combat scenes between centaurs and lapiths, as well as gods from the pediments, becomes a major cultural symbol. However, the controversy does not subside. Lord Byron, like other intellectuals of the time, highlights the offense to Greece of seeing one of its most prestigious temples thus stripped. In his poems, he expresses deep regret over the exile of these history-laden stones, accusing Elgin's diplomacy and personal passion of having been driven by profit and glory. The intellectual quarrel then extends beyond the narrow circle of aesthetes, fueling reflection on the protection of heritage. Voices rise to demand restitution, or, at least, to condemn the conditions under which these treasures left Athens. At the beginning of the 1820s, Greece, under Ottoman domination for several centuries, enters a period of major upheavals. The national movement, inspired by ideas of liberation and cultural renaissance, triggers the Greek War of Independence in 1821. At the heart of this ferment, Athens occupies a crucial place both symbolically and strategically. Although at that time it has not yet regained its status as the great ancient city it once was, its cultural prestige remains immense. The Parthenon, dominating the Acropolis, then finds itself at the crossroads of struggles between Greek insurgents and Ottoman forces, but it is no longer just a revered monument. It also serves as a military stake and an arms depot. When the siege of Athens resumes in 1826, the Acropolis suffers from intense artillery fire. The Ottoman forces, supported by the Egyptian Ibrahim Pasha, use batteries from below to pound the walls, while Greek fighters attempt to resist from the highest positions. In this context, the Parthenon is once again transformed into an improvised stronghold. Powder reserves are stored there, and observation posts are set up to survey the surrounding valleys. The damages continue to increase, as shells make no distinction between ancient stones and military targets. Already affected by several previous conflicts, the structure suffers further collapses, further compromising its integrity. In 1827, the French general Charles Fabvier, engaged alongside the insurgents, organized a daring campaign to retake the city. After consolidating Greek forces, he managed to invest Athens and drive out the Ottoman garrison. The Parthenon, already severely tested, nevertheless suffered the consequences of these street battles. Interior walls collapsed, and some columns bore marks from projectiles. Sources from the time describe an unrecognizable monument, its floor strewn with rubble and weapon debris. Despite the symbolic victory of the fall of the Ottoman garrison, the local population, exhausted by deprivation and destruction, could not envision the restoration of a sanctuary still seen by many as a distant luxury. The War of Independence dragged on until 1830, the date when Greece, supported by certain European powers, finally gained recognition of its autonomy. Nevertheless, Athens remained marked by the ruins and trauma left by the conflict. In 1832, the great powers appointed the Bavarian prince Otto of Wittelsbach to reign over the new kingdom. From the city of Nafplio, initially chosen as the capital, the young monarch took a particular interest in Athens' classicist heritage. He was convinced that restoring the Acropolis, and more specifically the Parthenon, would help forge the national identity of a still constructing state. This heritage, which mixed Hellenic pride and modernizing aspirations, would henceforth guide the country's heritage policy. From 1834, Athens was officially proclaimed the capital of the Kingdom of Greece. Otto I left Nafplio to settle in the ancient city, eager to revive its former splendor. The Acropolis, overlooking the city, had to symbolize the continuity between the glorious past of Hellenic civilization and the future of an independent nation. The Ottoman houses cluttering the surroundings of the Parthenon and other temples were deemed unworthy of the new urban landscape. They were gradually demolished to clear the view of the classical monuments. In this great movement of purification of the site, the objective was both aesthetic and political. It was about celebrating Greek history while affirming the break from the Ottoman period. The first substantial works were entrusted to foreign architects and archaeologists, among whom the Bavarians Eduard Schaubert and Stamachios Clinthus and the Danish Philhellene Christian Hansen stood out. Among these initial initiatives, the principle of anastylosis began to take shape. Inspired by practices already begun in the 18th century by enlightened travelers, anastylosis involves rebuilding a ruined structure from its original elements, ensuring that each block is replaced in its initial position. However, the methods remained meticulous and sometimes approximate due to insufficient archaeological knowledge. Sculpted pieces were lost, and some fragments were replaced without absolute certainty as to their exact position. Nevertheless, these initial attempts reflected the desire to restore part of the Parthenon's aura and structural integrity. There was even consideration of partially restoring the cella to better evoke the temple's sacred function, but the priority was first to stabilize what remained of the colonnade and to consolidate the most weakened elements. Throughout King Otto's reign, from 1832 to 1862, restoration efforts were hampered by budgetary constraints. The young kingdom struggled to stabilize its economy, largely dependent on aid and loans granted by France, the United Kingdom, and Russia. The state coffers could not cover in full the grandiose projects envisaged for the Acropolis. Yet, as Athens became more populated and urbanized, the fascination with the ancient site continued to grow. Travelers, diplomats, and European scholars came to visit the Parthenon, intrigued by the initial results of the clearing and partial anastylosis operations. The accounts published abroad helped shape the image of a reborn Greece, reclaiming its heritage. The international public, already sensitized by the War of Independence, closely followed the progress and eagerly awaited seeing the Acropolis rid of the stigma of the Ottoman period. After the deposition of Otho in 1862, his successor, King George III, continued the work of enhancing heritage sites. The construction efforts on the Acropolis, however, remained sporadic. The priorities of the Greek government shifted towards building modern infrastructure, such as roads, railways, and administrative buildings to support population growth. Despite these challenges, new excavation works were carried out under the direction of Greek architects trained abroad, who gradually adopted more scientific methods. More precise topographical surveys were conducted, and some scattered marble blocks were cataloged for potential reintegration into existing structures. As debates increased around respecting the original architecture, there was a growing desire to restore a readable silhouette to the Parthenon without resorting to hypothetical reconstructions. In 1874, a decisive turning point occurred with the creation of the Hellenic Archaeological Service, an official entity responsible for managing, studying, and preserving antiquities. Partially funded by the state, this institution brought together Greek and foreign scientists who combined their expertise in the conservation of monuments. Its primary objective was to prevent further deterioration and to better catalog the scattered relics on the sacred plateau. One of the first major projects was organizing a massive clearing operation to remove the accumulated rubble around the temples over the centuries. This delicate mission required rigorous precautions to avoid further destabilizing the structures. Engineers ensured the fragile columns were braced, while workers slowly cleared away earth and debris. Hiccups were inevitable. Fragments of sculptures were often found buried haphazardly, sometimes broken, requiring urgent cataloging to avoid losing them permanently. Thanks to this extensive undertaking, the appearance of the Acropolis gradually changed. Entire sections of the plateau were uncovered, making the ancient substructures more visible and preparing the ground for partial reconstructions. Recent structures were dismantled when they held no historical interest, and antique blocks were stored in temporary reserves. Artisans, including numerous stonemasons, established restoration workshops on site. There, they adjusted identifiable fragments. The activity was intense and debates intense. Should all these blocks be inserted into the edifice, or should a minimal preservation approach be prioritized? The cautious officials initially opted for consolidation rather than reconstitution. They deemed stabilizing the Parthenon a priority, especially since Athens, proud of its monument, wanted to make it accessible to scholars and visitors. Funding came from the monarchy and Phil-Hellene patrons, who saw it as an homage to Greek heritage. In these years, there was hope to restore the colonnade to its original harmony, with a more rigorous historical focus than before, but the task remained colossal. New discoveries emerged, such as a complete Doric capital unearthed under rubble, sparking enthusiasm. Engineers saw it as evidence that many elements were still buried. The Archaeological Service hoped to continue these excavations despite the high costs, convinced that each unearthed parcel would bring the Parthenon closer to its former glory, and the possibilities remained vast.